Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy wooden door of the medieval bridal chamber, where silk sheets smell faintly of lavender and rosewater, where candles cast trembling shadows on stone walls, and where two near strangers are about to share the most scrutinized, most ritualized, most anxiety-inducing night of their entire lives. You can almost hear the whispers echoing down the corridor outside, family members, priests, nobles, all waiting for proof that a marriage has truly begun. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, revealing why our ancestors turned something so intimate into something so terrifyingly public. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, or what time it is as you drift off. I love hearing from you. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're standing in the year 1347 somewhere in the Loire Valley of France. The wedding feast ended hours ago, but you're not alone yet. You won't be alone for quite some time, because before you and your new spouse can even think about privacy, before a single garment is removed, there's a knock at the chamber door. It's firm, deliberate. The kind of knock that doesn't ask permission, it announces authority. The heavy oak door swings inward, and a figure in ecclesiastical robes enters, carrying a silver aspergillum dripping with holy water. This is the parish priest, and he's here to bless your marriage bed. The blessing of the marriage bed wasn't a quick formality. This was serious spiritual business. The church taught that even marital intimacy carried risk. Demons lurked everywhere, especially in moments of vulnerability and pleasure. The bed itself, that massive wooden frame with its feather mattress and embroidered linens, needed consecration. The priest circled slowly, sprinkling holy water on each corner post, murmuring Latin prayers you only half understand. Benedict, Domine Thalamum Hunc. Bless, O Lord, this bedchamber. His voice fills the space, pushing into corners, claiming the room for God before it can belong to you. You notice your spouse's hands trembling slightly. Is it anticipation, terror, cold? The room feels crowded with invisible presences, angels and demons both, according to the priest, who now blesses the pillows, the blankets, even the wooden chest at the foot of the bed where your clothes will rest. He warns you, though his words are cloaked in euphemism, that certain acts are forbidden even between husband and wife. He doesn't specify which acts, not exactly, but his tone leaves little doubt that pleasure for pleasure's sake displeases the Almighty. Historians still argue whether these bedroom blessings were universal across medieval Europe or more common in certain regions and social classes. What we know for certain is that the Church's 13th century writings, particularly those of Thomas Aquinas, obsessed over marital sexuality. Aquinas wrote thousands of words about the marriage debt, the obligation spouses had to provide sexual access to one another, but always within strict parameters. The blessing ceremony reminded couples that even in marriage, even in privacy, they were never truly alone. God watched, the Church watched, and as you're about to discover, sometimes actual people watch too. The priest produces a small vial of oil, blessed specifically for this occasion. He anoints the headboard, making the sign of the cross, then turns to you both. In some regions, he would anoint the couple themselves, a thumb pressed to foreheads, a murmured prayer for fertility. Be fruitful and multiply wasn't just a suggestion, it was the entire justification for what was about to happen. Without the possibility of procreation, the Church taught, marital relations became sinful indulgence. no better than fornication. You catch a whiff of incense as the priest lights a small censer. Smoke curls upward, frankincense mixing with the lavender already scenting the linens. This detail isn't just atmospheric. Medieval people believed specific scents could repel evil spirits while attracting divine favour. Frankincense and myrrh, the gifts of the Magi, were thought particularly potent. Your bedchamber is being transformed into a sacred space, a temporary chapel where the sacrament of marriage will be physically sealed. Here's something that might surprise you. Some regional customs included the priest actually sitting in the room during consummation, separated only by a curtain or screen. He wouldn't watch. That would be scandalous, even by medieval standards, but his presence ensured everything remained spiritually proper. Imagine trying to relax knowing a man of God is sitting 10 feet away, rosary beads clicking softly in the darkness, ready to intervene if he hears anything that suggests sinful excess. The blessing finally concludes. The priest makes one final sign of the cross, this time over you both together, binding you not just legally but spiritually. As he withdraws toward the door, he reminds you that this union serves 3 purposes: procreation, obviously, the avoidance of sin through legitimate release, and mutual comfort. Notice which one he mentions last. Comfort, affection, love, these are acceptable but secondary. Your primary job tonight is biological and theological. The door closes behind him, but the weight of his presence lingers. The room smells like church now, like Sunday Mass, which is probably the least romantic association imaginable. You look at your spouse. Really look, perhaps for the first time, all day. The wedding ceremony was a blur of ritual and witnesses. The feast featured hundreds of eyes tracking your every gesture. And now, finally, you're alone. Except you're not. Because even though the priest has left, you can hear footsteps in the corridor outside. Voices, hushed but audible. Laughter, quickly stifled. Your mother-in-law is out there. Your father, his brothers, her sisters. The noble family who arranged this entire marriage, they're waiting. And they won't leave until they have confirmation that the marriage is real, complete, consummated. The blessed bed isn't yours yet. It belongs to family ambitions, property transfers, alliance politics. Your body, tonight, is a vessel for dynasty. The candles flicker as a draft sneaks through the shuttered window. Outside, in the castle courtyard or village square, you know that people are still celebrating, drinking, singing bawdy songs about what you're supposedly doing right now. Tomorrow morning, they'll expect evidence. They'll want to see proof that you fulfilled your obligation, that the marriage can't be annulled, that the alliance is secure. No pressure. Right. You move toward the bed, each step feeling heavier than it should. The mattress is stuffed with goose down, a luxury that signals your family's status. Poorer couples made do with straw, which crackled and poked through fabric, making every movement audible. At least you have that small mercy. The linens are crisp, recently laundered, and you notice they're white. Deliberately, intentionally white. Someone chose these sheets specifically for tomorrow's inspection, for the stain that's expected to appear, the proof that will satisfy the waiting witnesses. Your spouse sits on the edge of the bed, unlacing their sleeves with shaking fingers. Neither of you knows quite how to begin this. There were no sex education talks in medieval childhood, no frank discussions about what to expect. Girls learned from whispered conversations with married women, cryptic advice full of euphemisms. Boys learned from crude jokes and boasting, information filtered through bravado and misinformation. The church's official position was that sexual knowledge itself was dangerous, better to approach the marriage bed in innocent ignorance than with minds corrupted by understanding. a quirky detail that few modern people realise. Some medieval wedding contracts actually specified that consummation had to occur within a certain time frame, often within 3 days of the ceremony. If the husband failed to perform within that window, the wife's family could potentially annul the marriage and demand the return of the dowry. This added a ticking clock to an already pressure-filled situation. Performance anxiety isn't a modern invention. Medieval men faced it with even higher stakes. The blessing you just witnessed served another practical purpose beyond spiritual protection. It gave the couple a few extra minutes to compose themselves, to shift from public performance mode into something more intimate. The ritual created a boundary between the chaos of the wedding feast and the vulnerability of the bedchamber. When the priest spoke those Latin phrases, he was telling everyone else this space is now separate, sacred, different. Respect it, even if that respect only extended to waiting outside the door rather than in the room itself. The footsteps outside haven't faded. If anything, they've multiplied. You hear your uncle's distinctive laugh, then your new mother-in-law's sharp shushing sound. Someone drops something, maybe a wine cup, and there's a burst of giggling quickly suppressed. These aren't distant sounds from another floor of the manor house. These people are right outside your door, some probably leaning against the corridor wall, settling in for what might be a long wait. Welcome to one of medieval Europe's most mortifying traditions, witness consummation, where your most intimate moments have an audience you can't see but definitely can hear. The practice of keeping witnesses near the bridal chamber reached its peak among nobility and royalty, but it trickled down through social classes in various forms. For royal marriages especially, the stakes were astronomical. Entire kingdoms depended on legitimate heirs. Alliance treaties, territorial claims, and succession rights all hinged on proving that a marriage was properly consummated. You couldn't just take the couple's word for it, too much room for deception, annulment, or political manoeuvring down the road, so witnesses stayed close, sometimes disturbingly close, to verify that the deed was done. Picture the scene more clearly. In many noble households, the bedchamber doors weren't even fully closed. They might be left slightly ajar, or the witnesses might position themselves in an adjoining room with only a tapestry separating them from the marriage bed. The logic was both legal and theological. Marriage wasn't truly binding until consummation occurred, and without witnesses, how could anyone prove what happened or didn't happen in the dark? Your privacy matters less than property law, less than inheritance rights, less than the political alliance your marriage represents. Some royal weddings took this to extremes that sound almost unbelievable today. When 15-year-old Margaret Tudor married King James IV of Scotland in 1503, witnesses didn't just hover nearby, they actually entered the chamber after the couple was in bed, observed them lying together, and then formally testified to what they'd seen. Not the act itself, thankfully, but the couple's presence in the marriage bed in a state suggesting consummation would occur. These witnesses would later sign legal documents confirming their observations, creating a paper trail that legitimized the union. You try to ignore the sounds from the corridor and focus on your spouse, but it's nearly impossible. Every creak of the bed frame feels amplified. You're hyper-aware that any sound you make will be heard, interpreted, possibly discussed for years at family gatherings. Remember their wedding night? I was standing right outside the door. The witnesses aren't there out of perversion, at least. That's not the official reason. They're performing a social function, serving as human notaries for a contract being signed with bodies instead of ink. Historians still argue whether the psychological damage of these customs outweighed their legal utility. Some scholars point out that medieval people had different privacy expectations than we do. Shared sleeping spaces were common, and the idea of being alone was actually somewhat unsettling to medieval sensibilities. Others counter that the wedding night was universally recognized as anxiety-inducing precisely because of this surveillance. Anxiety isn't a modern emotion. It's threaded through medieval letters, diaries, and medical texts describing wedding night disasters triggered by pressure and scrutiny. Here's a detail that adds a layer of dark comedy to an already awkward situation the witnesses sometimes engaged in running commentary. They might call out encouragement, shout bawdy jokes through the door, or sing suggestive songs. This wasn't meant to be cruel, it was considered festive, a continuation of the wedding celebration. But imagine you're already nervous, already overwhelmed, and now your father-in-law is shouting rhymes about consummation through the oak planks separating you. Medieval humour had a cruel streak, especially when it came to sexual matters, in France, particularly among the nobility. There was a tradition called the coucher, literally, the putting to bed. This wasn't just witnesses waiting outside. This was the entire wedding party escorting the bride and groom to the bedchamber, helping them undress. We'll get to that nightmare in detail soon, and only then withdrawing to wait outside. The King's Chamberlain might personally verify that the royal couple was properly positioned for consummation before finally exiting. The line between ensuring legitimacy and violating intimacy was gossamer thin, and medieval society consistently chose legitimacy. Your new spouse whispers something you can't quite catch over the noise from the corridor. You lean closer, and they repeat it. Should we make them wait longer? There's a hint of rebellion in the question, a tiny spark of resistance against all these people who've controlled every moment of your day. But waiting has risks. The longer you delay, the more the witnesses might wonder if something's wrong. Impotence, refusal, cold feet. Delay feeds speculation, and speculation can poison a new marriage before it even begins. The church had opinions about witnesses too. Naturally, some theologians argued that witnesses violated the privacy that even married couples deserved. Others countered that without witnesses, annulments would become too easy. Couples could simply lie about non-consummation to escape unwanted marriages. The compromise in many regions was that witnesses should be present but discreet, near but not intrusive. In practice, discreet meant wildly different things to different people. Some families interpreted it as standing in the next room. Others thought pressed against the door with a drinking cup held to the wood to amplify sounds was perfectly reasonable. A quirky historical note in some German principalities. Professional witnesses could be hired if family members were unavailable, or if the couple wanted strangers rather than relatives listening to their first intimate encounter. These witnesses took their jobs seriously, providing sworn testimony that could be used in courts if the marriage's validity was ever challenged. Imagine putting professional marriage witness on your medieval resume. The going rate for this service varied, but it was considered a legitimate profession, complete with standards and protocols. The waiting witnesses served another function that's often overlooked: protection. In an era when accusations of witchcraft or demonic interference could arise from any unusual occurrence, having respectable witnesses who could testify that everything proceeded normally was actually a form of insurance. If the marriage failed to produce children, if the groom proved impotent, if anything went wrong, the witnesses could confirm that the wedding night itself was conducted properly, deflecting blame away from supernatural causes and toward more mundane explanations. You finally move closer to your spouse, trying to create a bubble of intimacy in this impossible situation. You're both thinking the same thing. How do you be genuine, vulnerable, tender, when you know a dozen people are tracking your every sound? Some couples according to later accounts, simply performed for the witnesses, making sufficient noise to satisfy expectations while actually doing very little, buying time until the household slept and real privacy arrived. Others went through with consummation mechanically, efficiently, treating it as one more wedding day obligation to check off the list. The architectural design of medieval manor houses and castles didn't help. Bedchambers often connected to other rooms through multiple doorways, sometimes without proper doors at all, just curtains or tapestries that muffled sound but created no real barrier. The grand bedchambers of the wealthy might have smaller adjoining rooms where personal servants slept, ready to assist at a moment's notice. Privacy as we understand it, 4 solid walls, a locked door. Assurance of solitude was a luxury even the rich rarely experienced. Your wedding night was just an extreme version of the daily reality that other people were always nearby. The sounds from outside shift. You hear someone, your brother. You think making a comment you can't quite make out, followed by raucous laughter. Then your mother's voice, sharp with reproach, silencing the group. A debate seems to be happening about whether the witnesses should remain or disperse, whether enough time has passed, whether their presence is helpful or harmful. You're not part of this debate, of course. You're the subject being discussed, not a participant in the discussion. Your agency in this moment extends only to what happens in this room, and even that feels negotiated, observed, judged by people who will never admit they were listening but who will somehow know everything by morning. Morning arrives with pale light filtering through the shutters, and you're exhausted not just from the night itself but from the tension that preceded it. The performance anxiety that turned intimacy into obligation. Your spouse stirs beside you, and you both become immediately aware of what comes next. This is the moment you've been dreading almost as much as the witnesses outside the door. Someone will come for the sheet, that white linen beneath you. The one deliberately chosen for its pristine colour is about to become public evidence. The bloody sheet custom wasn't whispered about in corners, it was celebrated, displayed, sometimes even paraded through streets like a battle standard announcing victory. You hear footsteps approaching, decisive and purposeful. The knock is brief, barely a courtesy before the door opens. In walks your mother-in-law, or perhaps your own mother, or sometimes both together, along with a few selected female relatives. Their faces are composed, businesslike, as if they're here to collect laundry rather than inspect the most intimate proof of your wedding night. They move straight to the bed, and you scramble out of it, wrapping yourself in a robe or blanket while they efficiently strip away the top sheet. They're looking for blood specifically, the blood that supposedly proves the bride's virginity was intact until last night. The sheet gets held up to the morning light, examined with an attention to detail that would make a crime scene investigator proud. Is that a stain? Yes, there it is, not large, but sufficient. Nods of approval circulate among the women. In some households, this sheet will now be taken to a window facing the street and hung out for neighbours to see. In others, it'll be preserved, folded carefully, and stored with important family documents. Some noble families kept these sheets for decades, producing them as evidence if anyone ever challenged the legitimacy of children born from the marriage. Your most intimate moment has become a museum artifact before breakfast. The practice varied wildly across medieval Europe. But the core concept remained consistent: virginity must be proven, and blood was the proof. In Spain, particularly in rural communities, the bloodied sheet might be displayed from a balcony while guests from the previous night's feast gathered below to cheer. Musicians might play, wine might flow, and the new husband's virility would be toasted alongside his bride's proven purity. The sheet became a certificate of authenticity, more valuable than any document a priest could sign. Historians still argue whether this custom genuinely protected women or simply subjected them to additional humiliation. Some scholars suggest it provided brides with a form of proof against accusations of previous sexual activity if you could produce the bloody sheet. Gossip couldn't touch you. Others point out the obvious: not all virgins bleed during first intercourse, and the custom created impossible pressure while leaving women vulnerable to suspicion and shame if their bodies didn't cooperate with social expectations. Here's where medieval creativity took a dark turn. Everyone knew, though few spoke about it openly, that not every bride would bleed. Maybe she was athletic, maybe her hymen was unusually elastic, maybe any number of perfectly normal anatomical variations made bleeding unlikely. So backup plans existed. A small vial of chicken blood tucked under a pillow, a sharp pin hidden in the bed frame to produce a deliberate scratch, berries crushed against the sheet in the night's confusion. These weren't discussed at respectable tables, but midwives knew about them. Mothers whispered about them, and some brides came to their wedding beds prepared with secret insurance policies. The pressure created a bizarre marketplace. In some Italian cities, women could discreetly purchase small bladders filled with animal blood, designed to be crushed at the crucial moment. These devices weren't technically illegal, but they operated in a moral grey area. Using one meant deceiving your husband, your family, the witnesses, possibly God himself, but it also meant avoiding social catastrophe. Some brides made the calculation that a small deception was worth avoiding a lifetime of suspicion or even annulment. You watch as your mother-in-law carefully folds the sheet, her expression satisfied. She's relieved. You realise your performance last night, yours and your spouse's, reflects on her family's honour too. If there had been no blood, questions would have arisen. Was the bride actually a virgin? Was she damaged goods foisted onto an unsuspecting groom? Did the marriage even truly occur? Or did the couple simply sleep side by side, leaving the union unconsummated and therefore voidable? The sheet answers all these questions with a single rust-coloured stain. In some regions, the inspection went beyond just the sheet. The bride herself might be examined by midwives or elderly female relatives, women who considered themselves experts in determining whether sexual activity had occurred. They might check for signs of recent intercourse, looking for physical evidence that complemented or contradicted what the sheet revealed. This examination could happen immediately after the wedding night or sometimes even before, with one check to confirm virginity before the ceremony and another to confirm its loss afterward. Medical knowledge in the medieval period was primitive, often wrong, but confidence was never lacking. A particularly grim detail if no blood appeared and the bride couldn't explain its absence. Accusations could escalate quickly. In extreme cases, marriages were annulled based on the missing blood evidence, with the bride returned to her family in disgrace. Her future marriage prospects evaporated. Whispers followed her everywhere. Was she promiscuous? Was she damaged? Was she cursed? The sheet's verdict was difficult to appeal, carrying more weight than the couple's own testimony about what occurred in the darkness. Royal weddings took a sheet inspection to theatrical extremes. When Princess Blanche of Castile married the future King Louis VIII of France in 1200, not only was the sheet examined, but official documents were drawn up describing the stain, its size, its location on the fabric, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who viewed it. These documents were filed with other crucial state papers, preserved alongside treaties and land deeds. The sheet itself might be displayed at court, shown to visiting dignitaries as proof of the marriage's legitimacy and the future heir's unquestionable lineage. The custom also created an odd sort of black market in vintage wedding sheets. Noble families sometimes kept these bloodied linens for generations, as mentioned, but occasionally they'd resurface in inheritance disputes or legitimacy challenges decades later. Imagine sitting in a medieval courtroom while lawyers argue over a 60-year-old stained sheet, debating whether it proves your grandmother's virtue and therefore your right to inherit property. The sheet that embarrassed you on your wedding morning might become your grandchildren's most important legal asset. Here's a quirky twist that shows medieval ingenuity. Some families developed elaborate rating systems for the blood evidence. A small stain might be acceptable, but unremarkable. A larger stain indicated vigorous consummation and was celebrated more enthusiastically. Too much blood. However, and concerns arose, was the husband too rough? Was the bride injured? Would there be lasting damage that might affect fertility? The Goldilocks principle applied: not too little, not too much, but just right. You couldn't win. Really, whatever your body produced would be judged, evaluated, assigned meaning beyond your control. The morning after your wedding, as your mother-in-law exits with the folded sheet tucked under her arm like a trophy, you feel the full weight of what just happened. Your virginity, your body's response, your most intimate experience, all of it reduced to a piece of fabric that strangers will examine and discuss. You'll hear about this sheet for years. At family gatherings, someone will inevitably mention it, usually in the form of a joke you're expected to laugh at. Remember when we all saw the proof, they'll say, nudging each other, while you smile tightly and change the subject. Your spouse looks as drained as you feel. Did they enjoy last night? Did you? It's hard to say when the entire experience was so clouded by obligation and observation. Some medieval couples, according to scattered letters and diary entries that survived, managed to find genuine connection even within these oppressive customs. Others simply endured, counting the wedding night as one more duty performed, one more social requirement satisfied. Love, if it came at all, would have to develop later, in stolen moments of actual privacy that might be months or years away. The scrutiny didn't end with the bloody sheet. The church, that omnipresent voice regulating every aspect of medieval life, had detailed opinions about what happened under those blessed linens. You might assume that once married, couples had freedom to express intimacy however they wished after all. The church encouraged procreation. Right, wrong. Medieval theologians, particularly those writing between the 11th and 15th centuries, produced extensive manuals outlining exactly which sexual positions were permissible, which were sinful, and which were so horrifically wrong they required immediate confession and severe penance. Thomas Aquinas, that towering intellectual of the 13th century, devoted substantial portions of his Summa Theologica to marital sexuality. According to Aquinas and theologians who followed his reasoning, there was essentially one acceptable position: man on top, woman beneath, face to face. This arrangement was called the natural position because it theoretically maximized the possibility of conception while minimizing pleasure, especially female pleasure, which the church viewed with deep suspicion. Any deviation from this position ranged from venial sin to mortal sin, depending on how far you strayed from the approved template. Why such specificity? The church taught that sexual pleasure, even within marriage, was dangerous because it echoed the forbidden fruit that caused humanity's fall from Eden. Intercourse was permissible only because procreation required it, and even then, couples should approach the act with solemn duty rather than enthusiasm. Enjoying sex too much suggested you were engaging in it for pleasure rather than procreation, which transformed a holy obligation into a sinful indulgence. You were supposed to conceive children while feeling as little pleasure as possible, a truly remarkable feat of mental gymnastics. The band positions read like a bizarre medieval Kama Sutra in reverse, woman on top absolutely forbidden. This position was called the wife's abuse of her husband, and was considered particularly grave because it inverted the natural order women should be submissive, not dominant, even in the marriage bed. From behind, also prohibited, too animalistic, too similar to how beasts coupled, therefore degrading to human dignity, side by side suspect, because it suggested leisure and mutual pleasure rather than procreative efficiency. Standing up. Don't even think about it, completely contrary to conception, and therefore completely sinful. Oral contact of any kind was so forbidden that confession manuals often used euphemisms to discuss it, and priests were instructed not to mention such acts unless a penitent specifically confessed to them. The reasoning was that informing people about these possibilities might inspire them to try, planting sinful seeds in innocent minds. Better to leave married couples ignorant of options than risk expanding their sexual repertoire beyond the missionary position. Knowledge itself was dangerous when it came to bedroom activities. Historians still argue about how strictly these rules were actually followed. Did average medieval couples really limit themselves to one position? Or did they nod along when the priest lectured about proper conduct, then do whatever they pleased once alone? We'll never know with certainty, but the sheer volume of prohibitions in church documents suggests someone was doing the forbidden things. Otherwise, why keep writing new rules? The church doesn't typically spend centuries condemning behaviours nobody engages in. Here's something that might surprise you. The church also regulated when married couples could have intercourse. Certain days were completely off limits. No sex on Sundays. Obviously that was the Lord's Day, reserved for worship, not physical pleasure. No sex on Wednesdays or Fridays either. The traditional fasting days. No sex during Lent. That 40-day stretch before Easter. No sex during Advent. The weeks before Christmas. No sex during menstruation, which was considered both medically dangerous and spiritually polluting. No sex during pregnancy once conception occurred. The procreative justification evaporated. No sex while breastfeeding, which could last 2 or 3 years per child. Add it all up, and the church approved of marital relations perhaps 40 to 60 days per year. The rest of the time, couples were expected to practice abstinence or risk sinning. Of course, theologians recognized this was difficult, so they created the concept of the marriage debt if one spouse requested intercourse. The other was obligated to provide it, even on forbidden days, because refusing might drive the requesting spouse to adultery or worse sins. This created a bizarre calculus where having sex on Sunday was sinful, but refusing your spouse's request was also sinful, so you had to choose which sin to commit. The confession manuals used by medieval priests included detailed questions about sexual conduct. If you confess to marital relations, the priest might ask, which position? What day was it necessary for procreation or done for pleasure? Did you use any methods to prevent conception? This level of interrogation meant your sex life, supposedly private after the wedding night witnesses finally left, remained under constant theological surveillance. God's representatives wanted detailed reports about what happened in your bed and when. Birth control was naturally completely forbidden. Any attempt to prevent conception transformed the sexual act from potentially holy to definitively sinful. Withdrawal before completion, sin. Herbal contraceptives, sin. Timing intercourse to avoid fertile periods if done deliberately, probably sin, though there was theological debate about whether it was sinful to simply know when conception was unlikely. Even within marriage, even in the approved position, on an approved day, if you took steps to prevent pregnancy, you'd committed a serious offence requiring confession and penance. A quirky historical detail, some theologians debated whether sexual pleasure in marriage was always sinful or only sinful when pursued as the primary goal. This created a bizarre grey area where you could experience pleasure as long as you felt guilty about it and didn't actively seek it. Enjoy yourself by accident, probably venial sin, minor penance required. Deliberately pursue enjoyment, mortal sin, soul-damaging, potentially hell-worthy. The mental contortions required to have sex while simultaneously not wanting to enjoy it but being unable to prevent some pleasure must have been exhausting. The Church's obsession with sexual conduct extended to some truly bizarre places. Some theologians argued that conception was more likely to occur when both partners remained calm and unaroused. Getting too excited supposedly made the womb too hot and killed the seed. Others claimed that female orgasm was necessary for conception, creating a theological paradox where priests simultaneously told women not to seek pleasure, but also that pleasure was required for pregnancy. Medieval medicine and theology often contradicted each other spectacularly, leaving married couples to navigate impossible expectations. Do you remember those witnesses outside your door on the wedding night? They weren't just verifying that consummation occurred, they were supposedly also listening to ensure it occurred properly. Excessive noise. Sounds suggesting forbidden positions or too much pleasure could theoretically be reported to the local priest. Whether this actually happened is unclear, but the threat existed, adding another layer of anxiety to an already stressful situation. Even your moans and sighs were being judged for theological correctness. The punishment for violating these sexual rules varied. Minor infractions might require saying extra prayers, fasting for a few days, or making a small donation to the church. More serious violations practicing the unnatural vice of contraception, for instance, could require months of public penance, standing outside the church in sackcloth while the congregation filed past on Sundays. Repeat offenders might be denied communion, effectively excommunicating themselves from the community. Your bedroom choices could have very public consequences. Some regional variations existed. Mediterranean Catholic countries tended to be slightly more relaxed than Northern European ones, perhaps due to different cultural attitudes about passion and pleasure. Eastern Orthodox Christianity had different rules, generally less restrictive about positions but equally concerned about holy days and procreative intent. Jewish communities in medieval Europe followed Talmudic law, which was actually more permissive about marital pleasure, recognizing it as a wife's right. An interesting contrast to Christian doctrine. But if you were a Christian medieval couple, and most were, the church's rules governed your intimate life whether you liked it or not. Before your wedding night even began, before the witnesses gathered and the priest blessed the bed, there was sometimes another ritual that sounds almost unbelievable to modern ears, the consummation inspection. For royal and high noble marriages especially, too much was at stake to rely on bloody sheets and witness testimony alone. Political alliances worth kingdoms, dowries representing fortunes, succession rights determining which family would rule for generations, these couldn't be left to chance or deception. So in some cases, brides were physically examined before the wedding to confirm virginity, and both bride and groom might be examined afterward to verify that consummation actually occurred. Imagine standing in a cold stone chamber, perhaps the afternoon before your wedding ceremony, knowing what's about to happen. Several women enter midwives, female physicians if any are available. Elderly noble women considered expert in these matters. They're here to examine you, to literally verify that your hymen is intact, that you're bringing an undamaged body to the marriage. You're instructed to lie down, to allow them access to your most private parts, to submit to prodding fingers and clinical assessment. Your mother might be present, your future mother-in-law certainly is, and perhaps a court official taking notes for the official record. These pre-wedding inspections happen most famously in French royal marriages. When Marie Antoinette married the future Louis XVI in 1770, she underwent this examination. Though that's technically beyond the medieval period, the practice had medieval roots stretching back centuries. The examiners would write detailed reports, hymen intact, no signs of previous sexual activity, bride confirmed suitable for royal marriage. These documents were filed with other state papers, becoming part of the permanent record. Your anatomy described in bureaucratic language. Your body's intimate details preserved in archives that historians would study centuries later. The post-consummation examinations were even more invasive. In some cases, within hours of the wedding night, both bride and groom would be examined separately. For the bride, midwives check for signs of recent intercourse, the torn hymen, any bruising or stretching, perhaps semen residue. Medieval medical knowledge was primitive, but practitioners were confident in their ability to determine whether sex had occurred. For the groom, the examination focused on capability. Was he anatomically normal? Was there evidence he'd recently been aroused and completed the act? These weren't quick glances but thorough inspections, accompanied by written reports. Why such extremes? The annulment laws created perverse incentives. If a marriage remained unconsummated, it could be dissolved as if it never existed. This gave unhappy spouses, or more often, their families, an escape route from unwanted alliances. But it also meant that consummation had to be proven beyond doubt to prevent fraudulent annulment claims years later. Better to endure one mortifying examination than face decades of legal challenges to your marriage's validity and your children's legitimacy. Historians still argue about how widespread these physical examinations actually were. Royal families definitely practiced them, with well-documented examples from France, England, Castile, and Aragon. But did they trickle down to lesser nobility to wealthy merchants? Probably in some regions, but not others, and documentation is sparse. What we know for certain is that the practice existed, was considered legitimate, and created tremendous anxiety for brides who faced it. The physical discomfort was bad enough. But the humiliation of being examined like livestock must have been psychologically devastating. The examiners took their responsibilities seriously, sometimes too seriously. There are recorded cases of disputed examinations where different medical practitioners reached different conclusions, leading to committee reviews and multiple re-examinations. Imagine being the bride at the centre of such dispute, examined once, findings questioned, examined again by a different midwife. Still no consensus, examined a third time by a panel. Your body becomes evidence in a legal proceeding where you have no voice, no control, no privacy. Here's a detail that adds dark comedy to horror. The examination process was sometimes described in excruciating detail in court documents, with technical terminology that medieval scribes dutifully recorded. These documents survive in various European archives, and modern historians occasionally publish them in academic journals. Your worst moment of vulnerability, experienced 600 years ago, can now be read by graduate students writing dissertations. The medieval period offered no right to be forgotten. Intimate examinations became permanent historical records. Some brides attempted to outsmart the system. We know from confession manuals and court cases that women sometimes tried to reconstruct their hymens before examinations using various folk methods, inserting alum to cause temporary tightening, using herbal preparations that supposedly restored virginity, even attempting crude surgical procedures. These efforts rarely succeeded and often caused injury. but desperation drove women to try anything rather than face examination and likely rejection if they'd already lost their virginity through choice or force. The examinations could reveal uncomfortable truths that created social catastrophes. If a bride was found to be pregnant during the pre-wedding examination, perhaps raped by a household member, perhaps engaged in a previous relationship, the marriage might be cancelled immediately, the dowry forfeited, and the bride's reputation destroyed. She'd become unmarriageable, likely ending up in a convent if her family had any resources, or facing destitution if they didn't. The examination meant to protect everyone's interests, often ruined the woman being examined. For grooms, the examination focused primarily on whether consummation was physically possible. Was he anatomically normal? Were there signs of impotence or other dysfunction? In cases where consummation failed on the wedding night, the groom might be examined to determine whether the failure was temporary performance anxiety or permanent physical inability. If the latter, the marriage could be annulled. But the groom faced public humiliation and suspicion. Whispers about his manhood would follow him to any future marriage negotiations. A quirky historical note: some regions developed standardized examination protocols, almost like medical checklists that examiners followed. These protocols specified exactly what to look for, how to document findings, what terminology to use in reports. The standardization was meant to ensure consistency and prevent disputes, but it also meant your most intimate examination followed a script refined through examining hundreds or thousands of previous brides. You weren't experiencing something unique. You were the latest person processed through an established system. The psychological impact of these examinations is hard to overstate. Modern trauma psychology recognizes forced intimate examinations as potentially deeply damaging, capable of causing lasting distress. Medieval people didn't have vocabulary for trauma or PTSD, but the letters and diaries that mention these examinations convey obvious distress. Women wrote about feeling violated, degraded, treated as objects rather than people. Some dreaded the examination more than the wedding night itself. At least your spouse was supposed to care about you. But the examiners were purely clinical, efficient, detached. Do you remember we mentioned the church's complicated relationship with marital sexuality? The examination practice created theological problems too. Some church authorities argued that these intimate inspections violated modesty and dignity, that they represented worldly concerns overriding spiritual principles. Others countered that protecting the sacrament of marriage justified temporary discomfort. The debate continued throughout the medieval period without clear resolution, meaning whether you faced examination or not often depended on local custom and your family's beliefs more than any consistent standard. The male physicians who occasionally participated in these examinations faced their own theological dilemmas. Touching a woman's intimate areas, even in a medical context, was considered potentially sinful and required careful spiritual management. Some physicians refused to participate entirely, leaving examinations to midwives and female practitioners. Others performed them but immediately went to confession afterward, seeking absolution for the physical contact required by their professional duties. Your examination might burden the examiner's conscience even as it invaded your body and dignity. The days leading up to your wedding included strange preparations that went far beyond choosing flowers and finalizing the guest list. Hidden in your trousseau, tucked between embroidered linens and your best chemise, might be a small cloth pouch containing substances your mother or grandmother pressed into your hand with whispered instructions. Inside, dried herbs, ground animal parts, mysterious powders that smell earthy and slightly rotten. These are your wedding night potions and aphrodisiacs. Medieval folk medicine meant to ensure fertility, enhance desire, guarantee consummation success, and generally manipulate biology through what we'd now recognise as mostly superstition mixed with occasional accidental effectiveness. The most common ingredient in bridal potions was mandrake root, that twisted plant that supposedly screamed when pulled from the ground. Medieval herbalists believed mandrake enhanced fertility and sexual desire in both men and women. Brides might drink mandrake tea before the wedding night, or wear a piece of the root in a pouch around their necks, or even place it under the mattress where its mystical properties would supposedly seep into the marriage bed. Modern chemistry tells us mandrake contains mild hallucinogens and sedatives, so brides drinking mandrake tea were probably experiencing altered consciousness rather than enhanced fertility. But nobody knew that at the time. Your wedding feast almost certainly included aphrodisiacs baked into the food without anyone announcing them. Oysters, already recognised for their supposed sexual properties, honey, which gives us the word honeymoon the month after the wedding when newlyweds drank honey wine to promote fertility and desire. Asparagus, considered powerfully arousing, almonds and pine nuts, ground into cakes and pastries, cinnamon and ginger, expensive spices that supposedly heated the blood and inflamed passion. The entire meal was designed as edible foreplay, though you probably ate nervously and tasted nothing. Some potions bordered on revolting, ground stag penis, because the rutting season virility of male deer might transfer to human grooms. Dove hearts, consumed raw on the theory that doves mate for life and their fidelity could be absorbed. Rabbit testicles dried and powdered into wine. Because rabbits reproduce prolifically, the sympathetic magic underlying these recipes assumed that eating animal parts transferred their properties, consume the genitals of fertile creatures, gain their fertility. Medieval logic operated on associations and metaphors rather than chemistry and biology. Historians still argue about whether these potions had any actual physiological effect beyond placebo. Some ingredients did contain compounds that might slightly increase blood flow or cause mild stimulation, but mostly, these concoctions worked psychologically if you believed the potion would make you desirable or fertile. You might act more confident, more relaxed, more open to intimacy. The belief created the effect, not the ground-up batwing or whatever else got mixed into your wedding cup. Here's something that reveals medieval desperation. Some recipes required incredibly rare ingredients, suggesting families spared no expense when it came to wedding night success. Ambergris, that waxy substance from whale intestines worth more than gold, supposedly the ultimate aphrodisiac. Civet musk from African wildcats, imported at enormous cost. Bizarre stones from goats' stomachs, believed to have magical properties. If your family was wealthy enough, they'd acquire these treasures and have them incorporated into your wedding preparations, transforming your consummation into an expensive chemistry experiment. The church officially condemned many of these potions, considering them witchcraft or at minimum trafficking with superstition, rather than trusting God's plan for fertility. But even devout Christians used them, creating cognitive dissonance they resolved by thinking. The priest blesses the bed, we drink the herbal tea, surely covering all bases is prudent. Some couples actually asked priests to bless their potions, baptizing the folk magic to make it theologically acceptable. Priests sometimes complied, sometimes refused, depending on personal theology and how much pressure the family applied. Female-specific potions focused obsessively on ensuring pregnancy. Your mother or mother-in-law might give you a draught of vervain and mugwort, herbs associated with women's mysteries and uterine health. Lady's mantle, whose leaves collect dew in a way that resembled female anatomy to medieval eyes, was brewed into bitter tea. Raspberry leaf, blessed thistle, red clover, an entire pharmacopoeia of plants believed to prime the womb for conception. Some of these actually do affect hormones or uterine tissue, though not in the magical ways medieval women believed. Male potions aimed at ensuring performance, attacking the anxiety that plagued many grooms facing wedding night pressure. Ginseng root, imported from distant Asia at great expense, was prized for enhancing male vitality. Fenugreek seeds, soaked and consumed. Tribulus terrestris, a plant with spiky seeds whose aggressive growth supposedly transferred to male virility. Grooms might be given these potions secretly, mixed into their wine during the feast, family members conspiring to drug them into adequate performance without their knowledge or consent. A quirky detail about medieval aphrodisiacs, many were based on the doctrine of signatures, the belief that plants resembling body parts could affect those parts. Carrots and parsnips, phallic in shape, obviously enhanced male organs. Oysters, resembling female anatomy, obviously enhanced female parts. Walnuts, looking like tiny brains, supposedly increased mental clarity during lovemaking. This reasoning sounds absurd now, but it was considered sophisticated natural philosophy in the medieval period, linking appearance to essence through divine design. Some potions were meant to be applied rather than consumed. Ointments made from crushed insects mixed with animal fat, rubbed onto genitals to increase sensation. Warming salves containing pepper or mustard seed, creating tingling that was interpreted as arousal. These preparations occasionally caused actual medical problems, chemical burns, allergic reactions, infections, but couples rarely connected cause and effect, instead blaming demons or curses when the ointments caused harm rather than help. Do you remember the witnesses waiting outside your door? Some of them might have been involved in preparing these potions. Grandmothers and aunts who considered themselves experts in wedding night preparations. They'd watch you drink the herbal mixture, nod with satisfaction, then take their positions in the corridor, confident that their botanical intervention would ensure success. If conception occurred within the year, they'd take credit, obviously their potion worked. If it didn't, well, perhaps you didn't drink enough, or mixed it incorrectly, or angered God through some sin that counteracted the herbs. The distinction between medicine and magic blurred completely when it came to wedding potions. Was vervain tea a medical treatment or a magical spell? Was wearing a piece of amber around your neck healthcare or superstition? Medieval people didn't really distinguish. Effective treatment was effective regardless of mechanism, and if something worked once, it became tradition. Your wedding night potion was simultaneously folk remedy, religious ritual, and wishful thinking compressed into a cup of foul-tasting liquid you choked down while everyone watched expectantly. Some potions had side effects nobody anticipated. Certain herbs caused drowsiness when couples needed alertness. Others produced digestive upset. Not ideal timing. Some made brides or grooms dizzy, disconnected, unable to perform the very acts the potions were meant to enhance. But admitting the potion failed meant admitting family wisdom was flawed. So couples blamed themselves they weren't pure enough, faithful enough, deserving enough, rather than questioning whether drinking powdered stag penis was actually a good idea. The brewing of these potions followed recipes passed mother to daughter across generations. Oral traditions rarely written down. This makes them difficult for historians to fully reconstruct, but scattered references in medical texts, trial records for witchcraft accusations, and occasional household recipe books preserve fragments. When you read these recipes now, they sound like fantasy novel ingredients. Take 3 scales from a dragon, probably meaning a type of lizard. Grind the stone from an eagle's nest, some kind of mineral deposit. Mix with tears collected at midnight, presumably just water, but poetry. The bedding ceremony was where medieval wedding festivities crossed from uncomfortable into nightmare territory. After hours of feasting, after the priest blessed the chamber and your parents negotiated final details, the moment arrived when the entire wedding party decided they hadn't humiliated you quite enough yet. They needed to personally escort you to bed, undress you, position you, and only then maybe leave you alone. This wasn't a quiet walk down a corridor with a few close family members. This was a drunken parade, bawdy songs echoing off stone walls, dozens of guests surrounding you and your spouse as you process toward the one room that should have been your sanctuary. Picture the scene more vividly. You're exhausted from a day that started before dawn with prayers and preparations. You've worn heavy formal clothing for 12 hours. You've smiled until your face aches, danced until your feet bleed, made conversation with relatives you barely know. And now, as evening deepens into night, someone, usually the most boisterous uncle or the bride's eldest brother, announces it's time for the bedding. A cheer erupts. Guests who've been drinking since midday surge toward you, forming a procession that's equal parts celebration and mob. The men surround the groom, the women surround the bride, and you're separated as the crowd marches toward the bedchamber. Songs fill the air, the kind that would make sailors blush. Verses about consummation, about physical anatomy, about what's going to happen once the door finally closes, all sung with enthusiastic vulgarity. Your grandmother sings along. The priest pretends not to hear. Everyone finds this absolutely hilarious except you and your spouse, who can barely look at each other across the crowd separating you. You reach the bedchamber door and it swings open to reveal the blessed bed waiting. The crowd doesn't stop at the threshold, they pour inside, filling the room that's already too warm from braziers left burning to ward off cold. Bodies press close, the smell of wine and sweat overwhelming the lavender and rosewater someone sprinkled on the linens. Now comes the truly mortifying part, the undressing. You don't get to retire privately to disrobe. The wedding guests will help you, whether you want help or not, and they'll make a party game of it. The women descend on the bride first, unlacing the complex fastenings of the wedding gown, peeling away layers, the overdress, the underdress, the kirtle, the chemise, until you're standing in very little while 24 people watch and comment. They're not cruel, exactly, but they're not gentle either. Someone makes a joke about your breasts, someone else remarks on your hips, speculating loudly about your fertility based on their width. Your body is being appraised like a horse at market while you stand frozen, unable to protest because this is tradition, custom, the way things are done. Across the room, the men perform the same service for the groom. His doublet comes off, then his shirt, his hose peeled down while friends slap his back and make suggestions for the night ahead. If he shows any sign of arousal, it's pointed out immediately to raucous laughter. If he doesn't, that's pointed out too with mock concern. Need some help there, perhaps another cup of wine. The poor man is caught between impossible expectations, simultaneously supposed to demonstrate virility and maintain some shred of dignity, while his clothes disappear in front of an audience. Historians still argue about whether couples were stripped completely naked during bedding ceremonies or left in their final layer of undergarments. It varied by region, social class, and family preference. Some sources describe brides and grooms completely nude, helped into bed while guests watched. Others suggest they retained a chemise or shirt, minimal covering that preserved technical modesty while still allowing the ceremony's humiliating essence. Either way, you're far more exposed than you ever wanted to be in front of your father-in-law, and there's no escape. Once undressed, you're guided, sometimes pushed toward the bed. The crowd parts slightly, creating a pathway, and you walk those final steps acutely aware of every eye tracking your movement. You climb into bed, pulling sheets up immediately for whatever protection they offer. Your spouse joins you from the other side, and for one brief moment it's almost intimate despite the audience, two terrified people taking refuge under covers while chaos swirls around them. But the guests aren't finished. Some traditions involved throwing the bride's stocking. Young men would stand at the foot of the bed and toss her stockings toward the couple. Hitting the groom supposedly predicted who'd marry next, or the women would throw the groom's hose, aiming for the bride's face. This devolved into a throwing game with everyone laughing while you and your spouse duck flying clothing. The symbolism was overtly sexual. These were items that touched intimate areas, now being tossed around like party favours, and nobody felt any shame about it. In some French regions, the guests prepared a special posset, a drink of spiced wine and eggs, and brought it to the bed, insisting the couple sit up and consume it while everyone watched. The drink supposedly enhanced fertility and pleasure, but really it was one more excuse for the party to continue. You'd sit there, sheet clutched to your chest, trying to sip the posset with dozens of faces inches from yours, voices shouting advice and commentary that made you wish the earth would open and swallow you whole. A particularly cruel tradition involved the younger guests hiding in the room after everyone supposedly left. You'd think privacy finally arrived, begin to relax slightly, maybe turn to speak to your spouse and someone would leap from behind a tapestry shouting surprise, triggering another round of laughter from co-conspirators. This prank could happen multiple times before the couple finally secured actual solitude, creating paranoia that destroyed any possibility of genuine intimacy for hours. Some regions practiced barring the door, where guests would pretend to leave but then push back inside if the couple tried to bar the door too quickly. It became a physical struggle, the newlyweds attempting to secure privacy, the guests forcing their way back in just one more time for additional jokes and songs. The door might be pushed open and slammed shut half a dozen times before the couple finally won the battle. By then, you're angry, exhausted, and intimacy is the last thing on your mind. Here's a quirky detail that shows medieval humour's dark edge. Some guests would return later in the night, after the couple presumably consummated the marriage, to serenade them with more bawdy songs. This Charivari tradition involved banging pots, singing loudly, generally creating noise designed to interrupt post-coital rest. The couple was expected to appear at the window or door and offer wine or coins to make the serenaders leave. It was extortion disguised as festivity, and it could continue sporadically through the night. Do you remember those wedding night potions from earlier? The bedding ceremony sometimes included forced consumption of additional aphrodisiacs, drunk not in private but publicly, with guests ensuring you swallowed every drop. An aunt might hold the cup to your lips while others chanted encouragement. The herbal mixture might taste vile, might make you gag, but you had to drink it while everyone watched and applauded. Your body wasn't your own, it belonged to family expectations, social traditions, the community's interest in your fertility. The servants who prepared the room often received instructions to create mischief. They might short-sheet the bed, or sprinkle itching powder between the linens, or hide something that would make a noise when the bed moved. These pranks were considered hilarious, ensuring that even after everyone left, the room itself contained traps and tricks. Your wedding night became an obstacle course of other people's humour, every moment designed by committee rather than emerging from genuine connection. Royal bedding ceremonies reached peaks of absurdity that make lesser nobles' experiences seem almost private. When Arthur, Prince of Wales, married Catherine of Aragon in 1501, the bedding ceremony involved dozens of courtiers. formal speeches about consummation, and official witnesses who remained in the chamber throughout the night, separated from the bed only by thin curtains. Arthur was 15, Catherine 16, and they performed the most intimate act of their lives with political observers taking mental notes 10 feet away. Throughout this exploration of medieval wedding nights, we've focused on the rituals and expectations, but there's an uncomfortable truth we need to address directly: the age of the participants. When you imagine a medieval bride, you might picture someone in their late teens or early 20s, perhaps nervous but reasonably mature. The reality was often far darker. Many medieval brides were children by any modern definition: 12, 13, 14 years old, married to men who might be decades older. The church set minimum marriage ages at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. But these weren't guidelines to avoid. They were targets. Minimums routinely reached and sometimes violated. You're lying in that marriage bed, maybe 12 years old, your body barely showing signs of puberty, and the person beside you is a stranger twice your age or more. This happened regularly, especially among nobility, where marriages were political arrangements made when children were still in cradles. The formal betrothal might occur at age 7 or 8, but consummation was supposed to wait until the church's minimum age. Supposed to. Whether it actually did varied wildly depending on the families involved, their desperation for heirs, and how much they cared about ecclesiastical rules versus practical concerns. The concept of consent as we understand it, informed, freely given, enthusiastic agreement between equals, simply didn't exist in medieval marriage law. Consent meant you didn't actively fight your way out of the church during the ceremony. It meant your father agreed to the match, transferring ownership of you from his household to your husband's. If you were a girl, you possessed almost no legal agency. You couldn't own property independently, couldn't make contracts, couldn't refuse a marriage your family arranged. Your consent was assumed the moment your father shook hands with your future father-in-law over dowry negotiations. Imagine being that 12-year-old bride. You've been told since birth that this day would come, that marriage is your destiny, your purpose, the only path available. You've been prepared in the vaguest terms for what marriage entails, whispered warnings from older women, euphemistic advice that raises more questions than it answers. And now you're in this bed with this man, and everyone expects you to simply accept what's about to happen, because your father signed papers and a priest spoke words you barely understood. Where's the room for refusal, for saying, "I'm frightened, I'm not ready, I don't want this"? There isn't any. The age disparity created power imbalances that modern minds recognise as inherently problematic. A 35-year-old man marrying a 13-year-old girl wasn't seen as predatory, it was strategic. He gained a young, fertile wife who'd produce many children. Her family gained connections to his wealth or title. She gained nothing she wanted, but everything society told her she should want: security, status, legitimacy. The marriage bed became the location where these transactions were physically sealed, regardless of whether the younger party understood or desired what was happening. Historians still argue about how to characterize these marriages without imposing modern values on medieval contexts. Some scholars emphasize that medieval people had different life expectancies, different concepts of childhood, different social structures that make direct comparison to modern child abuse complicated. Others counter that a frightened 12-year-old experiencing unwanted sexual contact with an adult is traumatized regardless of historical context, that suffering transcends time periods, that we can acknowledge medieval practices were normal for that era while still recognizing them as harmful. Here's what complicates the narrative further. Not all medieval marriages followed the child bride pattern. Among peasants and urban workers, marriages typically occurred later, men in their mid-20s, women in their late teens or early 20s. These couples married when they'd accumulated enough resources to establish households, when they'd learned trades or crafts, when they possessed some degree of life experience. The horrifying child marriages concentrated among nobility and wealthy merchants, where property and politics outweighed personal readiness. But those noble marriages set the cultural tone, created the legal frameworks that appeared in the chronicles and records that survived. When we discuss medieval marriage customs, we're often describing practices of the elite, the 5% whose lives were documented, not the peasant majority whose marriages might have been marginally more age-appropriate. Still, even among peasants, a 19-year-old man marrying a 14-year-old girl wasn't unusual, and that age gap, combined with total male authority within marriage, created dynamics we'd now recognise as coercive. The physical consequences of child marriage were often devastating. Girls married at 12 or 13 and immediately pregnant faced mortality rates that make modern medical professionals shudder. Their bodies weren't ready for pregnancy or childbirth. Complications obstructed labour, fistulas, hemorrhaging. Infection killed young brides at horrifying rates. Those who survived often suffered permanent injuries. But the pressure for heirs was relentless. Your value as a wife centred entirely on producing children, preferably sons. So pregnancy began immediately after menarche, whether your body could handle it or not. Some girls were married even before the church's minimum age, through betrothal contracts that included cohabitation clauses. You might be sent to live in your future husband's household at age 9 or 10, technically still unconsummated but already removed from your family, already under his control. These situations created opportunities for abuse that nobody monitored or prevented. If consummation occurred before the legal age, who would report it? The girl had no advocates. The husband controlled the household, and early pregnancy was often welcomed as proof of fertility. Do you remember the emphasis on virginity we discussed earlier? That obsession hit differently when the bride was a child. The bloody sheet proved not just premarital chastity, but also that she was young enough to still possess an intact hymen. Adult women who'd ridden horses extensively, engaged in physical labour, or simply had anatomical variations might not bleed during first intercourse, but children almost certainly would, making child marriage a perverse guarantee of that valued blood evidence. The custom incentivized younger brides, with all the horror that implies. The question of consent becomes even murkier when we consider that many medieval people married partners they'd never met before the wedding day. You're 12 years old, and the first time you see your husband's face is when he's standing beside you at the altar, that night, in the marriage bed. You're expected to accept intimacy with this complete stranger. There's no dating period, no courtship where affection might develop, no time to build trust or understanding. The wedding ceremony transforms you from child to wife in a few hours, and your body is expected to catch up instantly with your new legal status. A quirky but disturbing historical detail, some marriage contracts included provisions for delaying consummation if the bride seemed too young or underdeveloped. But these clauses existed to protect the husband's investment, not the girl's well-being. The concern was that pregnancy might kill her before she produced multiple heirs, wasting the dowry and political alliance. If the contract specified waiting, it might be until her first menstruation, or until age 14, or until she appears ready, vague language that gave husbands enormous discretion and created no real protection. The Church's position on child marriage was contradictory and ultimately ineffective. Officially, theologians acknowledged that very young spouses might not fully understand marriage vows, that consummation should wait for physical maturity, that forcing children into sexual activity was sinful. But the same church that set minimum ages at 12 and 14 also performed marriage ceremonies for younger children with papal dispensations, blessed beds where those children would be expected to consummate marriages, and rarely intervened when families ignored the rules entirely. Some medieval sources hint at recognition that child marriage caused suffering. Medical texts describe green sickness in young wives, probably anemia from early pregnancy combined with psychological distress. Advice manuals occasionally suggest husbands should be gentle with very young brides, acknowledging their fear and pain. But these scattered moments of almost empathy never coalesced into systemic change. The advantages of child marriage of families, for property consolidation, for political alliances outweighed any concern for the children experiencing it. The morning after the wedding night didn't end the scrutiny, sometimes it triggered an entirely different nightmare. If the marriage failed to consummate, if the groom couldn't perform or the bride refused or circumstances prevented the act, annulment became a possibility, and annulment proceedings, particularly for noble families, could involve church tribunals where the most intimate details of the wedding night were dissected in public forums, witnesses testified, physicians gave opinions, and the couple themselves might be questioned extensively about exactly what happened or didn't happen in that blessed bed. Your failure became community property, examined under ecclesiastical microscopes until everyone knew precisely why your marriage remained unconsummated. Imagine standing before a panel of church officials, bishops, canon lawyers, priests trained in theological intricacies of marriage law, and being asked to describe, in explicit detail, what occurred on your wedding night. These weren't private conversations. Tribunal proceedings happened in church courts with observers present, records kept, testimony transcribed. You'd be questioned about anatomy, about attempts made, and about whether the problem was physical impossibility or willful refusal. If you were the wife claiming non-consummation, you'd face skepticism. Were you lying to escape an unwanted marriage? If you were the husband, you'd face humiliation. Was your impotence permanent or temporary, physical or psychological? The grounds for annulment based on non-consummation were surprisingly specific. Permanent impotence could dissolve a marriage, but temporary impotence couldn't. The church expected couples to keep trying. But how do you prove the difference? Church courts develop tests, procedures that sound more like torture than jurisprudence. The husband might be examined by physicians who attempted to stimulate arousal, documenting whether his body could physically respond. If he could achieve erection with medical manipulation but claimed inability with his wife, the court might rule that spiritual or demonic interference was preventing consummation, prescribing exorcism rather than annulment. For wives, the examination focused on whether penetration had actually occurred. Midwives would be called to inspect, to testify about hymen status, about any signs of sexual activity. But this examination might happen months or years after the wedding night, making physical evidence ambiguous. Some women seeking annulment were clearly virgins, their testimony obviously truthful. Others existed in grey areas where medical examination couldn't definitively prove anything, and the tribunal would hear contradictory expert opinions while the woman's reputation disintegrated in public. Historians still argue about whether annulment proceedings protected women trapped in unconsummated marriages or simply created another arena for humiliation and control. Some women clearly used annulment strategically, escaping unwanted marriages by claiming non-consummation even when it wasn't strictly true. The Church's insistence on consummation as the binding element created a loophole, and some medieval women were clever enough to exploit it. But the cost was enormous: the public testimony, the examinations, the permanent stain on reputation that followed an annulment claim. The most famous annulment case from the medieval period involved Louis XI of France and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Though their annulment was granted on grounds of consanguinity rather than non-consummation, but many lesser-known cases filled church archives, transcripts revealing intimate details of medieval bedrooms. We can read testimony from 14th century wives describing their husband's inability to perform, using euphemisms when possible but forced into explicit language when church lawyers demanded clarity. We can read husbands' defensive testimonies, blaming wives for being too cold or insufficiently accommodating, deflecting impotence accusations onto female inadequacy. Some annulment cases involved accusations of witchcraft or demonic interference. If a marriage repeatedly failed to consummate despite both parties seeming physically capable, supernatural explanation became plausible within medieval worldview. Perhaps an enemy had cursed the marriage bed, or a demon prevented arousal, or malevolent magic tied invisible knots that made penetration impossible. These cases might involve bringing in exorcists, performing elaborate rituals to cleanse the couple and their bed, attempting consummation again after spiritual intervention. A quirky detail from annulment records: some couples claimed they'd successfully consummated, but later sought annulment on different grounds, requiring them to now argue their marriage was never properly consummated after all. This created bizarre situations where witnesses from the wedding night contradicted later testimony, where bloody sheets presented as proof years earlier were suddenly dismissed as animal blood or fakery. The malleability of evidence and testimony reveals how much room for manipulation existed within the system. The consequences of failed consummation extended beyond annulment possibilities. For the husband, whispers about impotence could destroy political credibility and social standing. Medieval masculinity centered heavily on sexual prowess and the ability to produce heirs. A man who couldn't consummate his marriage became a figure of mockery. His authority questioned, his fitness for leadership doubted. Some men in this position became violent, blaming wives for their own dysfunction, creating abusive situations that the church rarely intervened in. For wives, unconsummated marriage created different problems. If she remained a virgin but was legally married, she existed in liminal space, not quite maiden, not quite wife, unable to remarry unless annulment was granted. Some women spent years in these situations, legally bound to men who couldn't or wouldn't consummate, trapped in marriages that provided none of the promised benefits while imposing all the restrictions. They couldn't return to their birth families without shame, couldn't move forward into motherhood and full wifely status, simply suspended in dysfunction. Do you remember the pressure surrounding the wedding night? The witnesses and inspections and bloody sheets. All of that intensified if consummation failed, the second attempt, the third. However many it took or didn't take, each one carried escalating anxiety and scrutiny. Families might intervene, offering advice, sending physicians, consulting wise women. The couple's inability became everyone's business, discussed openly. Solutions proposed by people with no expertise but plenty of opinions. Privacy dissolved entirely as the community diagnosed and attempted to cure the consummation problem. Some couples developed workarounds that technically satisfied church requirements without achieving actual intercourse. Medieval medical understanding of anatomy was imperfect, and some church examiners could be fooled or persuaded that consummation occurred based on ambiguous evidence. A husband might achieve partial penetration, enough to claim the marriage was consummated even if completion never happened. A wife might cooperate in creating evidence blood from a small cut, signs of activity that satisfied inspectors while the actual sexual relationship remained troubled or non-existent. The 3-year rule created ticking clocks for unconsummated marriages. Church law generally held that if a couple lived together for 3 years without successfully consummating, annulment became much easier to obtain. This transformed the wedding night pressure into years-long pressure. Every failed attempt documented in the couple's minds as they calculated time passing. Some couples stuck it out, hoping the problem would resolve. Others began planning annulment strategies from early in the marriage, gathering witnesses and building cases for eventual tribunal presentation. Annulment proceedings could drag on for years themselves, especially when both parties fought or when political considerations complicated matters. During this time, the couple often continued living together, their marriage simultaneously real and not real, consummated or not depending on who you asked. Children born during contested annulment proceedings faced legitimacy questions. Property divided in anticipation of annulment might be reclaimed if the marriage was suddenly upheld. The legal chaos created by non-consummation annulments affected entire extended families, not just the couple at the centre. A particularly grim reality, some women who successfully obtained annulments based on non-consummation found themselves unmarriageable afterward. Even though church courts confirmed their virginity, the stigma of participating in a failed marriage followed them. Prospective husbands worried if the first marriage couldn't consummate. Perhaps she was the problem, too cold or too resistant or cursed in some way. The annulment that freed her from one impossible situation often condemned her to permanent spinsterhood or convent life. Medieval Europe wasn't a monolithic culture, and wedding night customs varied dramatically as you travelled from the misty fjords of Scandinavia down to the sun-baked hills of Spain, from the Celtic edges of Ireland across to the Byzantine-influenced territories of Eastern Europe. What was considered normal, even mandatory, in one region might be completely unknown or actively condemned in another. These regional variations reveal both the creativity of human ritual making and occasionally, surprisingly, practices that were far more progressive than the mainstream customs we've been exploring. Your wedding night experience depended enormously on where and when you lived, which traditions your family followed, which local customs held sway. In Scandinavia, particularly among Norse-influenced communities that retained pre-Christian elements well into the medieval period, the wedding night involved different priorities. The bed blessing still happened, but it might be performed by a vulva, a wise woman with pagan associations alongside, or instead of a Christian priest. These blessings invoked Freya, goddess of love and fertility, as much as the Christian god. The emphasis was less on sexual restraint and procreative duty, more on mutual pleasure and the sacred nature of physical union. Some Norse wedding traditions included both bride and groom bathing together before the ceremony, a shocking level of premarital physical intimacy by Southern European standards. Scandinavian customs also featured the morning gift, a present from husband to wife given the morning after the wedding night, specifically compensation for her virginity. This practice acknowledged that she'd given something valuable that couldn't be returned, and the gift, often land, jewellery, or significant money, became her personal property that she controlled independently. This created at least minimal economic agency within marriage, a stark contrast to Southern European customs where wives owned nothing independently. The morning gift implied a transactional element to the wedding night that some historians find disturbing. But it also granted women property rights most medieval wives never enjoyed. Down in the Iberian Peninsula, both Christian and Moorish influences shaped wedding customs. creating unique hybrid traditions in Christian kingdoms like Castile and Aragon. The wedding night followed church guidelines but incorporated regional flair. The bedding ceremony might involve flamenco-style music, rhythmic hand-clapping, and improvised poetic verses about consummation that were raunchy but also genuinely artistic. Spanish families put enormous emphasis on the bloody sheet display, with elaborate mourning ceremonies where female relatives would carry the sheet through the house, sometimes into the street singing victory songs. In Moorish territories and among conversos converted Muslims and Jews, wedding night customs drew from different religious traditions. Islamic law required consummation to complete marriage, similar to Christian doctrine, but the emphasis on female pleasure was notably different. Islamic legal and medical texts from medieval Iberia discussed female orgasm as important for conception and marital harmony, a sharp contrast to Christian theologians' suspicion of female pleasure. Jewish wedding traditions included the ketubah, a marriage contract that specified the husband's obligations to provide sexual satisfaction, giving wives explicit contractual grounds to demand intimacy. Another progressive element absent from Christian marriage law. In Celtic regions Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany, older pagan traditions lingered beneath Christian veneer. Hand fasting, a trial marriage that lasted a year and a day before becoming permanent, persisted in some areas despite church opposition. Couples might live together, including sexually, during this trial period. If the woman became pregnant and both parties remained satisfied, the marriage was formalized with full ceremony. If not, they could separate without stigma, a remarkably pragmatic approach that gave both partners far more agency than permanent from day one Christian marriage. Some Scottish clans practiced bundling, where courting couples would spend the night together fully clothed in bed, sometimes with a board between them, supposedly to allow conversation and assessment of compatibility without sexual activity. Whether the board actually prevented intimacy is debatable. Bundling babies were common enough to suggest the practice's safeguards were imperfect. But the underlying principle that couples should know each other before permanent commitment represented a dramatically different approach than arranged marriages consummated with strangers. Historians still argue about how widespread these regional variations actually were versus how much they represent idealized or exceptional cases documented because they were unusual. What we know for certain is that medieval Europe was far more diverse in its marriage practices than simplified narratives suggest. Your experience as medieval bride or groom depended heavily on local custom, your family's specific traditions, whether your region was firmly under church control or retained some independence, and whether you lived in cosmopolitan trading cities exposed to multiple cultures or isolated rural areas where ancient customs persisted. Eastern European traditions added yet more variety. In some Russian principalities, wedding ceremonies included elaborate pre-Christian rituals involving baking special breads, tying symbolic knots, and invoking household spirits. The wedding night might begin with the couple sharing specially prepared foods meant to ensure fertility, caraway bread, honey, and eggs in rituals that predated Christianity by centuries. Orthodox Christian priests blessed these practices rather than fighting them, creating syncretic traditions that mixed theological authority with folkloric magic. In some Polish and Lithuanian regions, the bride's female relatives performed a ritualized preparing of the bride that sounds almost like armor donning before battle. They'd braid her hair in specific patterns, dress her in an embroidered shift bearing protective symbols, and whisper advice that was surprisingly explicit and practical compared to the vague euphemisms common elsewhere. These women created networks of female knowledge transmission, teaching each new bride what to expect, how to protect herself. What herbs could prevent pregnancy if needed information the church condemned but women preserved anyway? Do you remember the invasive inspections and public sheet displays we discussed? Some regions rejected these practices entirely. In certain areas of what's now Germany and the Low Countries, Protestant Reformation ideas about privacy and dignity, even before the Reformation formally began, meant wedding nights were considered genuinely private. Witnesses might escort the couple to the chamber door but wouldn't presume to enter or remain nearby. The morning after, the couple's word that consummation occurred was accepted without demanding physical proof. These communities somehow trusted married couples to tell the truth. A radical concept compared to the surveillance-heavy customs elsewhere. Italian city-states developed their own variations, influenced by Roman law traditions and the peculiar politics of places like Venice, Florence, and Genoa. Marriage contracts in these cities could be incredibly detailed, specifying not just dowries and property arrangements, but also expectations around sexual frequency, grounds for separation, and mechanisms for dispute resolution. Some contracts even included clauses about where the couple would live, how often the wife could visit her birth family, and what would happen to her dowry if the marriage failed. This contractual approach made marriage more like a business partnership, which sounds unromantic but actually gave both parties, especially wives, more clarity and protection than the vague expectations of most medieval marriages. A quirky detail from Venetian records: some wealthy families hired professional witnesses whose only job was observing the couple's public interactions for months after the wedding, documenting marital harmony or discord for potential future legal proceedings. These observers would note whether the couple seemed affectionate, whether they fought, how they spoke to each other, creating a surveillance system that extended far beyond the wedding night itself. Your entire first year of marriage became evidence in cases that might not be filed for decades. The Byzantine Empire's marriage customs, preserved in Greek territories and Orthodox communities, combined elaborate church ritual with Roman legal traditions. The wedding ceremony itself was more extended and liturgically complex than Western Christian versions, with multiple blessings, crown exchanges, and symbolic acts. The wedding night was considered the private conclusion to this elaborate public ceremony, and Byzantine culture put more emphasis on the mystical union of souls than the physical union of bodies. This didn't mean less pressure or scrutiny, but it shifted focus slightly, making the wedding night one part of a spiritual process rather than the single moment when everything changed. In frontier regions and newly Christianized territories, customs were often more flexible by necessity. Small settlements couldn't support the elaborate rituals of established communities. When a village had 30 people total, the bedding ceremony parade was less impressive. Marriages happened with minimal ceremony. Priests might visit only once a year to formalize unions that had already occurred, and couples sorted out their own wedding nights without much external interference. These frontier marriages were often more egalitarian. By default, both partners worked brutal hours just to survive, making strict gender hierarchies less practical than mutual cooperation. The door finally closes, the witnesses finally disperse, and you're alone with your new spouse, but not quite, because in the next room, or perhaps just down the corridor, or maybe in a small alcove off the bedchamber itself, there's another group waiting. Not family members this time, not drunken guests making crude jokes. These are the midwives, those professional women whose entire lives revolve around female bodies, reproduction, and the messy realities of sex and birth. They're here because their services might be needed, because someone has to verify what happened, because the transition from virgin to wife sometimes requires medical intervention or at minimum professional observation. The midwife's role in the wedding night is one of medieval culture's stranger customs, blending healthcare, quality control, and voyeurism in ways that made an already uncomfortable situation even worse. Midwives in medieval Europe occupied a unique social position. They were usually older women, past childbearing themselves, who'd accumulated decades of experience with female anatomy and reproductive processes. The church both needed them and suspected them needed their expertise for births and medical matters, suspected their knowledge of contraception and abortion made them potential witches. Midwives walked a careful line, positioning themselves as respectable professionals while possessing knowledge the church considered dangerous. Their presence at weddings put them in another delicate situation. They were there to help, but also to police. To ensure the bride's body performed correctly, the midwife might enter the chamber immediately after the couple finished, or she might wait nearby for a summons if problems arose. In wealthy households, she'd be stationed in an adjacent room, perhaps with an assistant, ready to respond within seconds. Her job was multifaceted. She'd check for excessive bleeding that might indicate injury, verify that consummation had occurred successfully, offer immediate comfort or medical treatment if needed, and provide her expert opinion on whether the marriage had been properly completed. She was part physician, part witness, part counsellor, and entirely intrusive. Imagine you're the bride, and you've just experienced your first sexual encounter awkward, painful, perhaps briefly pleasurable, maybe traumatic depending on your spouse's skill and consideration. Your body is bleeding slightly, you're emotionally overwhelmed, you desperately want to sleep or cry or simply process what just happened. Instead, there's a knock at the door, and the midwife enters before you can refuse her. She approaches the bed with professional efficiency, asks you to lie back, and begins an examination that feels like a violation after the violation you've just endured. She's checking your body, commenting on what she finds, perhaps speaking to an assistant who's taking mental notes for later report to your mother-in-law. The midwife would examine the sheet, naturally, looking at blood stain with expert eyes that could supposedly distinguish hymenal blood from menstrual blood from deliberate fakery. She'd assess quantity and colour, making determinations about whether this blood truly proved virginity or might have alternative sources. If the stain seemed insufficient or suspicious, she'd examine the bride directly, looking for the torn hymen, checking for signs of penetration. This examination happened while you were still emotionally raw, physically sore, desperately wanting privacy that medieval culture refused to grant. Historians still argue about whether midwives generally supported young brides or served primarily as agents of patriarchal control. The evidence is mixed. Some midwives clearly advocated for the women they examined, writing reports that protected brides from accusations of prior sexual activity, offering comfort and advice, teaching young wives how to manage pain and potential pregnancy. Other midwives seemed more concerned with pleasing the families who paid them, providing the reports that husbands and fathers wanted, regardless of what they actually observed. Like any profession, medieval midwifery included both compassionate practitioners and those who prioritized profit over people. The midwife's expertise extended to solving problems when things went wrong. If the groom couldn't achieve penetration, the midwife might offer practical advice, different positions, relaxation techniques, herbal preparations. If the bride experienced severe pain or bleeding, the midwife could provide immediate treatment, using herbal poultices, soothing ointments, or simply experienced hands that knew how to ease discomfort. Some midwives carried supplies specifically for wedding nights: clean cloths, healing salves, wine mixed with pain-relieving herbs, anything that might be needed to help the couple through the physical challenges of first intercourse. A particularly uncomfortable aspect of the midwife's role involved providing instruction to completely ignorant couples, if neither partner had any idea how sex actually worked. The midwife might literally direct them, verbally explaining what went where, how penetration occurred, what sensations to expect. Some midwives did this from outside the bed curtains, maintaining some semblance of privacy. Others apparently stood right there, watching and correcting like a particularly horrifying gymnastics coach. The line between helpful instruction and traumatizing intrusion was microscopic, and medieval culture didn't recognize the distinction anyway. Do you remember the church's rules about approved sexual positions? Midwives were sometimes expected to enforce them. If a couple attempted something forbidden and the midwife witnessed or heard evidence of it, she was theoretically supposed to report the sin to local church authorities. This made midwives potential spies in the bedchamber, their professional presence doubling as moral surveillance. Whether midwives actually reported on sexual position seems unlikely. They'd lose all client trust immediately, but the theoretical obligation existed, adding another layer of anxiety to their presence. In some regions, midwives were required to sign official documents or provide sworn testimony about what they observed during post-wedding night examinations. These documents survive in various archives, and they're remarkably explicit. Midwives described the bride's hymen status, the blood quantity and appearance, their professional opinion on whether penetration had been completed successfully, sometimes even comments on the couple's emotional state and whether they seemed genuinely married or merely going through motions. Your most intimate moments reduced to bureaucratic language, filed away in church or civic records, potentially reviewable by strangers for centuries. The midwife also served as the bride's first source of information about pregnancy prevention or achievement. Depending on what the bride wanted, officially, midwives were forbidden from providing contraceptive knowledge that was considered facilitating sin. Practically, many midwives knew which herbs prevented pregnancy and which promoted it, and they shared this information discreetly with brides who asked. Some midwives apparently had entire secret pharmacopoeias, passed from mentor to apprentice, containing recipes the church would have condemned, but women desperately needed. The wedding night examination created a private moment where such knowledge could be exchanged. A quirky detail from midwives' accounts, they often noted whether the couple seemed affectionate or cold toward each other, including this observation in their reports. This information could become relevant in later annulment proceedings or inheritance disputes. A midwife's testimony that the couple seemed genuinely affectionate on their wedding night might support claims of marital harmony decades later. Conversely, notes about coldness or visible reluctance could undermine a marriage's legitimacy if challenged. The midwife's observations extended far beyond physical examination to include emotional and relational assessment, making her a remarkably powerful figure. For the groom, the midwife's presence was less intrusive but still uncomfortable. She wouldn't examine him directly unless there were questions about his capability, but her presence meant another witness to his performance, another person judging his adequacy as a husband. Some midwives apparently offered men herbal preparations to enhance performance or increase the likelihood of conception, trading remedies that were probably useless but psychologically reassuring. The placebo effect works regardless of century, and desperate grooms took whatever help was offered. The morning after visit from the midwife became standard in many regions. She'd return to check on the bride's physical recovery, to assess whether any tears or injuries needed continued treatment, to offer advice about hygiene and healing. This follow-up visit was genuinely medical rather than investigative, and many brides probably appreciated having an experienced woman to consult about soreness, bleeding, or concerns they couldn't voice to anyone else. The midwife became a confidant, someone who'd seen everything and could offer practical wisdom without judgment, at least. The good midwives did. Beyond the church's rules and the family's expectations, beyond the bloody sheets and the witness testimony, there existed another layer of anxiety surrounding the medieval wedding night, the invisible dangers. Demons, evil spirits, curses, malevolent magic, these supernatural threats felt absolutely real to medieval couples, as tangible as the wooden bed frame and far more frightening. The wedding night was considered a spiritually vulnerable moment when dark forces might interfere, preventing consummation, causing impotence, stealing fertility, or even possessing one partner or both. An entire apparatus of protective rituals, charms, and superstitions developed around defending the marriage bed from otherworldly attack, transforming the bedchamber into a spiritual battlefield where angels and demons supposedly fought over your reproductive future. The threat was taken seriously at every social level. Peasants and nobles alike believed that envious neighbours, rejected suitors, or simply malicious individuals could curse a wedding, and these curses supposedly manifested most powerfully during consummation. The term ligature described magical binding that prevented sexual intercourse. Imagine invisible knots tied around genitals, supernatural paralysis that made arousal impossible, demonic interference that transformed desire into revulsion. Medical texts of the period discussed ligature alongside physical causes of impotence, treating supernatural and natural explanations as equally valid and requiring different treatments. You'd take precautions starting before the wedding itself. Salt scattered across the threshold of the bedchamber supposedly prevented demons from entering salt's preservative qualities, and its use in Christian baptism made it spiritually potent. Iron objects, particularly horseshoes or knives, might be hidden under the mattress because iron was believed to repel fairy folk and evil spirits. Some couples wore small bags of herbs around their necks during the ceremony and into the marriage bed vervain. St. John's wort, rowan berries, each plant associated with protective properties. You were wearing a botanical armour system against invisible enemies. The marriage bed itself received protective treatment. Remember that priest blessing the bed at the beginning? Part of his role was spiritual fumigation, driving out any demons or curses that might be lurking in the wood frame or feather mattress. But couples often added their own protections. Crosses carved into the bedposts, sometimes barely visible, prayers against evil etched into wood, relics, fragments of saints' bones or cloth that touched holy objects sewn into the mattress cover. In some regions, people believed that having a rooster crow near the bed at dawn would dispel any demons that might have infiltrated during the night, because roosters crowing announced Christ's resurrection, and demons couldn't withstand that reminder. Historians still argue about whether belief in wedding night curses reflected genuine spiritual anxiety or provided convenient explanations for sexual dysfunction. Impotence and painful first intercourse were common, but medieval people lacked modern understanding of psychology, anatomy, and the effects of anxiety. Blaming demonic interference was less shameful than admitting performance problems or physical incompatibility. If ligature caused the failure rather than the groom's inadequacy, the marriage could potentially be saved through spiritual intervention rather than ending in annulment and disgrace. The specific rituals to break supposed curses were elaborate and often expensive. If a couple experienced repeated consummation failures, they might consult a wise woman walking that dangerous line between folk healer and witch who would diagnose the problem and prescribe solutions. These might include bathing in water blessed by 7 different priests, consuming special potions made from obscure ingredients, performing sexual intercourse at a specific astrological moment when planetary alignment supposedly overpowered demonic influence, or making pilgrimage to shrines associated with fertility miracles. Desperate couples tried everything, blending Christianity and paganism without worrying about theological contradictions. A particularly dark superstition held that envious unmarried women could curse wedding nights through sheer jealousy, their unfulfilled desire becoming malevolent magic that prevented others' consummation. This belief fed into medieval misogyny that portrayed single women as threatening, their very existence supposedly dangerous to married couples. Brides might be warned against making eye contact with unmarried women on the wedding day, or advised to avoid certain spinsters known for looking with bad eyes. The fear created social rifts between married and unmarried women, with the latter suspected and ostracized. Some protective rituals involved the bride's clothing. The wedding gown might be blessed before the ceremony, or special undergarments would be prepared with prayers stitched into seams. Some traditions required the bride to wear red garters or ribbons because red supposedly repelled evil, an interesting inversion since red was also associated with sexuality and the devil. The contradictory symbolism didn't bother anyone. What mattered was accumulating as many protective elements as possible, creating layers of spiritual defense against supernatural attack. Do you remember those aphrodisiac potions? Some were meant to counteract curses rather than simply enhance desire. If ligature was suspected, counter-magic potions might include bizarre ingredients specifically chosen because they seemed powerful, or rare water collected from 9 different springs, herbs picked during a full moon by a virgin, animal parts from creatures associated with fertility. The logic was sympathetic magic. Powerful components would create powerful effects. Whether these potions had any physical impact was irrelevant. Their psychological effect on anxious couples was probably significant. The Church's relationship with these protective superstitions was predictably contradictory. Officially, the Church condemned magic and superstition, teaching that only prayer and sacraments should be used against evil. Practically, many priests participated in folk practices, blessing the salt that got scattered, providing relics for mattresses, performing exorcisms when ligature was suspected. The line between approved religious ritual and forbidden superstition was blurry and constantly negotiated. Priests served communities that absolutely believed in demonic wedding night interference. So they adapted theology to address practical fears. Exorcism for suspected ligature was a real practice with documented cases. If a couple couldn't consummate and suspected curse rather than physical problem, they might request exorcism from their parish priest, or seek out clergy known for skill in spiritual warfare. The ritual might involve prayers over the couple, blessing of the marriage bed again, sprinkling more holy water, and commanding any demons present to depart in Christ's name. If the couple successfully consummated afterward, the exorcism was deemed successful. If they didn't, perhaps the curse was stronger than anticipated, requiring a more powerful exorcist or additional spiritual remedies. A quirky historical detail: some regions developed specific saints associated with wedding night success. In parts of France, Saint Guignol supposedly protected against impotence, and couples made offerings at his shrines before weddings. The offerings were sometimes remarkably explicit, wax models of genitalia, hoping the saint would ensure those body parts function correctly. These shrines were technically Christian holy sites, but the practices surrounding them were barely distinguishable from pre-Christian fertility cult worship. The Church tolerated this as long as devotion flowed through Christian channels. The belief in curses created opportunities for blackmail and manipulation. Someone could threaten to curse a wedding, then offer to lift the curse for payment. Whether the curse was real didn't matter, the fear was real. and frightened families paid. Some enterprising individuals made decent livings as curse lifters, travelling from village to village offering their services to anxious couples. The church condemned these practitioners as charlatans or worse, witches, but demand persisted because fear persisted. For couples who genuinely believed themselves cursed, the psychological burden was crushing. Every failed attempt at intercourse confirmed the curse's power, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where anxiety itself caused the dysfunction that anxiety predicted. Modern sex therapy recognizes that performance anxiety is one of the strongest impediments to sexual function, and medieval couples experienced this in extreme form, complicated by supernatural explanations that made the problem seem unfixable through ordinary means. Breaking the curse required something extraordinary, something magical, something beyond human control, which meant some couples never escaped the cycle. The morning after a successful wedding night, when the sheet was displayed and consummation confirmed, there was sometimes a ritual of thanksgiving specifically directed at defeating whatever curses might have threatened. Prayers of gratitude, offerings at church, sometimes public statements that essentially said, "We succeeded despite any evil wishes against us." This was simultaneously spiritual devotion and social one-upmanship, announcing that your marriage was strong enough to overcome supernatural opposition, that any envious rivals had failed to prevent your happiness. Not every wedding night proceeded according to plan. In fact, disaster struck often enough that medieval literature, court records, and medical texts are filled with accounts of what happened when things went catastrophically wrong. Impotence that wouldn't resolve, injuries requiring immediate medical attention, brides who refused to cooperate, grooms who couldn't perform despite desperate attempts, bleeding that wouldn't stop, fainting, vomiting, even death in extreme cases. The wedding night was a high-pressure situation where bodies and minds frequently failed under stress. And when disaster struck, the consequences rippled outward, affecting not just the couple but entire families whose political and economic futures depended on successful consummation. The failures became stories, whispered warnings, cautionary tales that made every subsequent bride and groom even more anxious about their own upcoming ordeal. The most common disaster was simple impotence. The groom, overwhelmed by pressure, exhausted from wedding festivities, perhaps drunk, possibly terrified of his new wife or traumatized by the witnesses and expectations, simply couldn't achieve or maintain erection. This happened frequently enough that it appears constantly in medieval sources, always described with varying degrees of sympathy or mockery depending on the writer's perspective. For the groom experiencing it, the shame was immediate and crushing. He'd been performing masculinity all day strong, capable, ready to claim his wife, and now, in the crucial moment, his body betrayed him completely. The witnesses outside could probably deduce the problem from the silence. The lack of expected sounds, the extended delay. Some grooms panicked when initial attempts failed, making the problem worse. They'd try repeatedly, becoming increasingly frantic, while their frightened brides endured the fumbling and pressure. Medieval advice texts occasionally acknowledged this problem, suggesting that couples should rest and try again later. That haste made things worse. But with witnesses waiting and family honour at stake, patience was difficult. The groom felt every passing minute as additional proof of inadequacy. The bride wondered if she'd been married to a defective husband. And the situation spiralled into mutual anxiety that made success nearly impossible. Physical injury was another nightmare scenario, particularly given medieval ignorance about female anatomy and the lack of preparation many brides received. Forceful penetration of a frightened, tense bride could cause tears that extended beyond the hymen into vaginal tissue. These injuries bled more than expected, caused severe pain, and sometimes became infected in an era without antibiotics or proper understanding of hygiene. The midwife would be summoned immediately, and she'd do what she could, applying pressure to stop bleeding, using herbal preparations that supposedly promoted healing, perhaps stitching tears with needle and thread if she had surgical training. The bride's wedding night transformed into a medical emergency, trauma rather than intimacy. Historians still argue about how common severe injuries were versus how much medieval sources exaggerated for dramatic effect. What's clear is that the combination of young brides, ignorant or inconsiderate grooms, and pressure to prove consummation created conditions where injury was more likely than in less coercive situations. Some brides suffered permanent damage scarring that made subsequent intercourse painful, injuries that complicated future childbirths, psychological trauma that made intimacy forever associated with pain and fear. In extreme cases, brides died from wedding night injuries or complications. These deaths were rare enough to be noteworthy when they occurred, but common enough that medieval people knew they were possible. Bleeding out from torn tissue, infection that spread and became septic, or shock from pain and trauma all could kill in an era of primitive medicine. A wedding celebration could transform overnight into a funeral, the groom going from husband to widower in hours, families devastated by a death that happened during what should have been a joyful beginning. Some of these deaths were recorded in church documents with remarkable coldness. Bride died on wedding night from injuries sustained during consummation. The clinical language masked human tragedy. Refusal was another category of disaster, though this mostly appears in records when the wife refused rather than the husband. Patriarchal societies documented female defiance more carefully than male failure. Some brides, once in the marriage bed, simply said no. They'd been pressured into the marriage, perhaps, or realised in that final moment they couldn't go through with it, or were too frightened to cooperate. Medieval law and theology were clear that wives owed the marriage debt and couldn't refuse husbands sexual access. But actual enforcement was complicated. Could a husband rape his own wife to consummate the marriage? Legally, yes. Morally, the church said maybe. Practically, it depended on how much noise she made and whether anyone intervened. Do you remember the witnesses outside the door? If a bride screamed in refusal rather than pain, they'd hear it. Some families apparently forced consummation to proceed regardless. This was property transfer, alliance sealing. Too important to derail because of a girl's reluctance. Other families, or perhaps just less ruthless individuals, might pause and try to negotiate, offering the bride time to adjust, bringing in her mother or another woman to counsel her. These negotiations happened with the groom standing awkwardly in the room, his masculinity undermined by his wife's rejection, his authority challenged before it could even be established. Male refusal appears less often in records, but surely happened. A groom might find, upon seeing his bride undressed or attempting intimacy, that he felt no desire or active revulsion. Arranged marriages meant you might meet your spouse for the first time on the wedding day, and physical attraction wasn't guaranteed. Some grooms apparently just refused to proceed, walking out of the bedchamber, leaving brides bewildered and families enraged. These cases often led quickly to annulment proceedings, the groom claiming inability or the marriage being dissolved as unconsummated. But the social fallout was enormous for everyone involved. Violence during the wedding night appears in enough sources to suggest it wasn't rare. Grooms frustrated by impotence, or simply brutal by nature, sometimes became violent, hitting or forcing their wives in ways that caused injury beyond what penetration alone would cause. Brides had essentially no recourse. They couldn't flee to their birth families without admitting marital failure. They couldn't report violence to authorities because husbands had legal right to correct wives. The wedding night could introduce a woman to the violence she'd endure for the rest of her marriage. The first lesson in her powerlessness within the institution she'd just entered. A particularly grim category involved discovery of pregnancy. If the bride was already pregnant from a previous relationship or assault, this might become apparent during the wedding night examination. The groom might notice, or the midwife might discover it. The consequences were catastrophic for the bride: immediate annulment, almost certainly, return to her family in disgrace, permanent unmarriageability, possibly being sent to a convent or worse. The groom could claim he'd been defrauded, demand the dowry back with additional compensation, publicly humiliate the bride's family. A wedding night discovery of pregnancy destroyed lives and family reputations. Fainting and vomiting appear frequently in accounts, suggesting the stress level was often unbearable. Brides overwhelmed by fear, pain, or the potions they'd consumed might faint during or after intercourse. Grooms might vomit from excessive alcohol consumption, anxiety, or revulsion. These bodily failures added humiliation to an already fraught situation. Bodily fluids mixing with blood and other substances in the marriage bed, creating scenes more reminiscent of battlefield medicine than romantic consummation. The servants who cleaned the chamber the next day saw things that never made it into official records, but surely circulated as gossip. Some couples facing evident disaster made desperate bargains. They might agree to fake consummation, producing the bloody sheet through alternative means, making sufficient noise for witnesses, then separating within the bed and trying again another night when pressure was less intense. These conspiracies required both partners' cooperation, creating odd intimacy between strangers who'd just agreed to deceive their families together. If the deception worked, the couple bought time to develop actual relationship before attempting real consummation. If discovered, the consequences for fraud could be severe. Amid all the horror and pressure, the invasive inspections and political machinations, the supernatural fears and social performance, there existed rare moments of something different. Not every medieval marriage was a nightmare transaction between strangers. Not every wedding night involved trauma and duty alone. Some couples, whether through fortunate compatibility, prior acquaintance, genuine affection, or simply mutual kindness in an unkind system, managed to find connection despite the oppressive framework surrounding them. These stories are harder to document because happiness leaves fewer records than disaster. Love generates fewer legal proceedings than dysfunction. But they existed. Letters, poetry, private diary entries, and occasional chronicles hint at medieval couples who genuinely cared for each other and approached the wedding night as something more than obligation. In some communities, particularly among peasants and urban workers where survival required partnership, couples knew each other before marriage. You might marry someone from your village, someone you'd grown up alongside, worked with, perhaps even courted within the limited boundaries medieval society allowed. This familiarity didn't eliminate wedding night anxiety, but it softened it. You weren't climbing into bed with a complete stranger. You knew this person's laugh, their temperament, maybe even felt genuine affection. The witnesses and rituals still happened. The pressure and expectations still existed, but underneath was a foundation of actual relationship rather than pure transaction. Some arranged marriages, despite beginning as political or economic contracts, developed into genuine affection before the wedding night. Betrothals often occurred years before actual marriage, and during that time, couples might correspond through letters, meet at family gatherings, develop understanding and even fondness. By the time the wedding arrived, they weren't strangers anymore. They'd negotiated their future together, made plans, perhaps shared hopes and fears. The wedding night still carried pressure, but it also carried anticipation of intimacy with someone you'd come to care about rather than dread of assault by a stranger. There are documented cases of medieval couples expressing genuine love in private writings. Letters between husband and wife, preserved in family archives or monastery collections, sometimes reveal tenderness, desire, playfulness, and emotional intimacy that contradicts the narrative of medieval marriage as purely functional. One 14th century Italian merchant wrote to his wife during business travel, expressing a longing not just for home but specifically for her company, her conversation, her presence in their bed. These weren't flowery, courtly love poems addressed to unavailable ladies. These were husbands writing to wives about actual marital affection and desire. Historians still argue about how to interpret these affectionate sources. Some scholars suggest they represent exceptional cases, arguing that most medieval marriages remained essentially loveless partnerships. Others counter that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Perhaps affectionate marriages were common but generated less documentation because they weren't problematic. Happy couples didn't require church tribunals, didn't fight over property in courts, didn't leave the kind of paper trail that dysfunctional marriages created. We might be systematically underestimating medieval marital happiness simply because it was invisible to record keepers. The concept of growing into love appears in medieval advice literature, suggesting contemporaries recognized that affection could develop after marriage rather than preceding it. Writers advised young couples to practice patience, kindness, and mutual respect, promising that these would eventually generate genuine fondness even if initial attraction was absent. This wasn't modern romantic love ideology, but it acknowledged emotional dimensions of marriage beyond pure procreation and property management. Some couples apparently succeeded at this gradual cultivation of affection, transforming duty into something warmer over months and years together. Do you remember all those oppressive rules about sexual positions and forbidden days? Some couples clearly ignored them, pursuing pleasure and connection despite theological prohibition. The very existence of confession manual questions about sexual variety proves that married couples were experimenting beyond the approved missionary position. Some must have been doing so joyfully, exploring intimacy together, finding pleasure in each other's bodies despite the church's insistence that pleasure was sinful. These couples probably never discussed their private activities publicly, but their very existence challenges the narrative that medieval sexuality was entirely repressive and joyless. Some wedding night accounts, rare but real, describe tenderness. A 15th century French chronicle mentions a nobleman who, on his wedding night, apparently spent hours simply talking with his young bride, easing her fear before attempting consummation, and then proceeding with such gentleness that she later spoke appreciatively of his consideration. This behaviour was noteworthy enough to be recorded, suggesting it was uncommon. But it happened. Some grooms, whether from natural empathy or deliberate virtue, chose kindness when they could have chosen force, creating wedding night experiences that were fundamentally different from the traumatic norm. Female-authored sources, though rare, sometimes reveal different perspectives on medieval marriage and wedding nights. The letters of Marjorie Kemper, a 15th century English mystic, discuss her marriage with surprising frankness, acknowledging sexual desire and pleasure alongside spiritual concerns. Christine de Pizan, that remarkable medieval feminist, wrote about marriage as potentially companionate, arguing that mutual respect and affection were possible even within patriarchal structures. These women's writings suggest that some medieval wives experienced marriage as more than endurance, that pleasure and partnership were achievable even when society didn't prioritize them. The morning gift tradition in some regions, mentioned earlier regarding Scandinavian customs, could become a genuine expression of gratitude and affection. While it originated as compensation for virginity, some husbands apparently chose gifts that reflected actual knowledge of their wives' preferences, particular jewellery styles. Books if the wife was literate. Property that gave her independence. These thoughtful gifts suggest relationships where husbands paid attention to wives as individuals, where the marriage was becoming partnership rather than remaining pure domination. A quirky detail from medieval love poetry, some poems addressed to wives rather than unattainable ladies survived, suggesting that spousal romance, while not the dominant literary tradition, existed as a recognisable possibility. These poems describe marital intimacy with warmth and desire, celebrating the wife's body and the poet's fortunate access to it. They're far less numerous than courtly love poems to unavailable noble women, but they're not non-existent. Some medieval men apparently felt and expressed genuine romantic love for their actual wives, a radical concept in a culture that theoretically separated marriage from romance entirely. Some couples managed to carve out genuine privacy despite the intrusive customs. A determined couple might refuse bed and ceremony participation, might insist witnesses stay further away, might create boundaries that protected their intimate space. This resistance was easier for powerful nobles who could enforce their preferences. But even some peasant couples apparently negotiated privacy through careful relationship building with their communities. If your village respected you, they might honour your request for less intrusive wedding customs, creating space for actual intimacy rather than public performance. The existence of remarriages after spousal death suggests that some medieval people specifically chose to marry again because they'd enjoyed the first marriage. Widows and widowers who could have remained single, particularly wealthy widows who gained independence after husbands died, sometimes chose remarriage. While economic and social pressures certainly influenced these decisions, some people explicitly stated they wanted the companionship marriage provided, suggesting their first experience had been positive enough to voluntarily repeat it. Medieval medical texts occasionally acknowledged female pleasure as important for marital harmony, not just conception. Some physicians argued that wives who experienced pleasure were healthier, more fertile, and better partners. This wasn't dominant medical opinion, but it existed, and some couples apparently took this advice seriously. There are scattered accounts of husbands consulting physicians about how to pleasure their wives, seeking knowledge that would improve their marriages. These men were trying, within their limited understanding, to create mutually satisfying intimate relationships. The medieval wedding night customs we've explored, the blessed beds and bloody sheets, the witnesses and inspections. The potions and superstitions didn't simply vanish when the medieval period ended. They evolved, softened in some ways, persisted stubbornly in others, and left traces that still haunt modern wedding traditions, even when we've forgotten their origins. You might attend a contemporary wedding and witness rituals whose roots stretch back to those anxious medieval bedchambers, customs that once carried enormous pressure and scrutiny, but now exist as harmless traditions we perform without understanding their darker histories. The legacy is everywhere once you know to look for it, hidden in plain sight beneath layers of romanticism and modern reinterpretation. The tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold, that supposedly romantic gesture where the groom lifts his wife and carries her into their home, has medieval roots in beliefs about evil spirits and curses. The threshold was considered a spiritually dangerous boundary, where malevolent forces might trip the bride or cause her to stumble, which was interpreted as an evil omen for the marriage. By carrying her across, the groom supposedly protected her from these dangers while also demonstrating his strength and ability to provide protection. Modern couples perform this gesture thinking it's simply romantic or traditional, completely unaware they're reenacting a superstitious defense against demonic interference. The honeymoon itself, that post-wedding period when couples retreat for privacy, evolved partially from the need to escape the invasive scrutiny we've discussed. As social customs gradually shifted toward respecting marital privacy, couples began leaving immediately after weddings for destinations where witnesses, family members, and midwives couldn't follow. The term honeymoon references the honey wine that medieval couples drank to promote fertility. But the modern practice of travelling after the wedding represents a flight from the kinds of observation that once made wedding nights so traumatic. You're essentially fleeing the bedding ceremony when you book that post-wedding resort vacation. The white wedding dress tradition, popularised by Queen Victoria in the 19th century but with earlier roots, connects to the obsession with virginal purity that drove bloody sheet customs. White symbolised virginity, and wearing it publicly announced the bride's supposed innocence. Modern brides often wear white without thinking about this symbolism, or they choose white simply because it's traditional without endorsing the purity culture that created the tradition. But the expectation, the slight scandal if a previously married or pregnant bride wears white, reveals that the old associations still lurk beneath contemporary wedding aesthetics. Do you remember the bedding ceremony, with its drunken guests undressing the couple and making crude jokes? Modern versions persist in far gentler forms. The tradition of removing the bride's garter, with the groom reaching under her dress while guests watch and cheer, is a direct descendant of medieval undressing rituals. The throwing of the garter to unmarried men parallels those medieval stocking-throwing games. Contemporary wedding receptions have tamed these customs almost beyond recognition, but they're performing the same basic function, making the couple's sexuality and future intimacy into public spectacle, even if we've reduced the invasiveness to a brief, slightly embarrassing moment rather than full bedroom invasion. Wedding night jokes and innuendo, those supposedly harmless comments about having fun tonight or not getting much sleep, echo the bawdy songs medieval guests sang outside bedchambers. Modern guests think they're being playful, perhaps slightly naughty, continuing a fun tradition of teasing newlyweds. They don't realise they're perpetuating customs that once accompanied genuinely traumatic surveillance, that their jokes about the couple's impending intimacy are distant echoes of a culture that refused to grant sexual privacy even to married couples. The tone has changed from cruel to light-hearted, but the underlying assumption that the couple's sexuality is appropriate subject for public commentary remains. Historians still argue about when and why the shift toward marital privacy occurred. The Reformation disrupted Catholic Church authority over marriage, potentially reducing clergy involvement in bedrooms. Enlightenment ideas about individual rights and dignity gradually reshaped expectations around privacy. Industrial urbanization allowed couples to establish households far from extended family, creating physical distance that made constant surveillance impossible. The change wasn't sudden or complete. Some invasive customs persisted into the 19th century in certain regions, but gradually, the wedding night became what it is now, a private experience between spouses, their intimate life, their own business rather than community property. The morning after brunch or breakfast, a common feature of modern multi-day wedding celebrations, evolved partly from the morning after inspections and sheet displays. Medieval families gathered the morning after the wedding to confirm consummation occurred. Modern families gather to see the newlyweds for the first time as a married couple, perhaps still scrutinizing for signs of marital success, but doing so subtly rather than demanding blood evidence. The function is similar communal acknowledgement that the marriage has truly begun, but the method has become civilized, transformed from intrusive investigation into simple social gathering. Some contemporary cultures retain more obvious connections to medieval practices. In certain Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, and North African communities, wedding night virginity proof remains culturally important, with sheets still displayed or women still examined. These modern practices are often labelled as specific to those cultures, as if they're exotic traditions unconnected to Western history. But they're directly parallel to medieval European customs that only recently faded from Western practice. The uncomfortable truth is that Western culture performed the same rituals for centuries. We've simply forgotten or chosen to forget this shared history. The advice industry surrounding wedding nights books, articles, websites offering guidance to nervous couples descends from medieval confession manuals and medical texts that attempted to regulate intimate behaviour. Modern advice emphasises pleasure, communication, and mutual satisfaction, vastly different from medieval insistence on procreative positions and minimal enjoyment. But the underlying assumption that wedding night intimacy requires expert guidance, that couples need instruction rather than trusting their own instincts, connects directly to medieval beliefs that sexuality was dangerous territory requiring professional navigation. Modern discussions about consent in marriage, about recognizing marital rape as a crime, represent hard-won reversals of medieval legal and theological positions. The medieval concept of marriage debt, the idea that spouses owned sexual access to each other and couldn't refuse, persisted in many legal systems into the 20th century. Only recently have most jurisdictions recognized that marriage doesn't constitute blanket sexual consent, that wives can refuse husbands without violating marital obligations. This legal revolution overthrows 1,000 years of medieval precedent, and resistance to it often comes from those who, perhaps without realizing it, are defending medieval assumptions about marriage, bodies, and power. The anxiety many modern people feel about wedding nights worries about performance, about meeting expectations, about doing it right echoes medieval anxieties. Though the specific pressures have changed, contemporary couples worry about pleasure and satisfaction rather than producing bloody proof for witnesses, about emotional connection rather than avoiding demonic curses. But the wedding night remains, for many, a high-pressure situation fraught with expectations both internalised and external. We've eliminated the witnesses and the midwives, but we've replaced them with internalised cultural narratives about what wedding night sex should be, creating pressure that's self-imposed rather than family-imposed, but pressure nonetheless. The very idea that a wedding night should be sexually special, that there's something magical or uniquely significant about the first intimate encounter as a married couple, is itself a medieval legacy. Premarital sex has become far more common and accepted in contemporary Western culture, meaning many couples have been intimate long before their wedding night. Yet the expectation persists that the wedding night should somehow be different, more meaningful, transformative. This belief descends directly from medieval theology that taught marriage made sexual activity holy, that the same physical acts performed before marriage were sinful, but after marriage became blessed. We've secularized the concept, but retained its essential structure. Wedding night hotel suites with rose petals, champagne, and special amenities cater to this expectation of unique significance. the wedding industry has monetized medieval beliefs about the wedding night's importance, transforming theological concepts into commercial opportunities. You're buying an experience that's supposed to be transcendent, special, different from ordinary intimacy, a contemporary version of the blessed bed, the sacred space where marriage becomes real. The priest's blessing has been replaced by luxury hospitality, but the underlying assumption that this night requires special preparation and significance remains unchanged. Some modern couples actively reject wedding night expectations, choosing to simply sleep after exhausting wedding days, or to not have their first married sex on the wedding night at all. This rejection represents genuine departure from centuries of tradition that insisted consummation must happen immediately to validate marriage. But even these couples are responding to the tradition, defining themselves against it. Conscious that they're breaking an expectation, the medieval wedding night customs still exert influence by their absence, shaping behaviour even among those who choose not to follow them. The gradual improvement in wedding night experiences from traumatic public performance to private intimate connection represents broader progress in recognising individual dignity, bodily autonomy, and the right to privacy. But progress isn't linear or complete. In many parts of the world, oppressive wedding night customs persist. Even in supposedly progressive cultures, wedding nights can be complicated by alcohol, pressure, exhaustion, and expectations that transform intimacy into performance. We've come far from bloody sheets and bedding ceremonies, but the journey toward wedding nights characterized by genuine consent, mutual pleasure, and freedom from external pressure remains incomplete. The candles have burned low now. The stories of medieval wedding nights with all their pressure and pageantry, their terror and occasional tenderness begin to fade like candlelight against approaching dawn. You've travelled through centuries of custom and ritual, through bedchambers where frightened couples navigated impossible expectations, where witnesses waited and midwives examined, and priests blessed beds that should have been private sanctuaries. You've seen how intimacy became public performance, how bodies became evidence, how the most vulnerable moments of human